should use the microphone. I start again. Welcome, dear audience, at home and at present, here in person in this beautiful museum. Welcome on behalf of the Meijers Committee and on behalf of, I think I may say, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Today we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention. Is that something to congratulate us with? Of course. It is good to celebrate that some 150 states 70 years ago agreed to take responsibility for people who were, due to persecution, forced to leave their countries of origin. However, at the same time, it is sad that in the 70 years that followed, we hardly can say that the situation of refugees has improved. The current instrumentalization of migrants by the criminal President Lukashenko of Belarus seems to me an all-time low. Also, the subject of today, reception in the region, at first sight is not something enjoyable. Reception in the region is currently employed as an euphemism for keeping refugees out of Europe. I personally strongly feel that we need to resist this type of discourse. I believe that Europe has a responsibility to welcome refugees and not to exclude them from Europe. This is why I initially hesitated on organizing a conference on this subject. What made me change my mind? Reception in the region is not only a discourse, but also a reality. Not in the sense that the anti-refugee discourse is currently dominant in the European Union, but rather that the vast majority of refugees are hosted by developing states. According to UNHCR statistics, more than 85% of the current 79.5 million refugees and displaced persons is staying in their countries of origin or in the regions of the countries of origin. Generally, these are very poor countries. We, asylum law scholars in Europe, are generally focused at what happens in Europe or in other industrial countries, not at what happens in Africa, the Middle East, or Latin America. Also, the Meijers Committee is a committee of legal experts that focuses on European legislation. So why this conference? My first response is that we all too often have a Eurocentric bias, which we need to overcome. Secondly, currently, refugee reception outside of Europe is also part of European legislation. Global compacts, EU compacts, bilateral agreements, and broad coalition partnerships all affect Europe's role in the refugee reception worldwide. And thirdly, most importantly, we have to consider an obligation of solidarity with the countries in the region. What we want to address in this conference is precisely Europe's role outside of Europe. What are the concrete effects of all these recent policy initiatives, programs, funds, and conventions? Are they programs that fulfill the ideals, ambitions, and rights of the Refugee Convention? Or are they merely designed to, as I mentioned previously, to keep refugees out of Western states, Western rich industrialized states? In other words, what rights do these initiatives secure, and in whose interests are they pursued? Another urgent question that we want to address today is what effects these new policies have on host communities. Willem Hutte, who prepared this conference, told me that policymakers like to speak about the humanitarian development nexus, meaning the need to combine humanitarian and development approaches to refugee reception. This indeed seems to be important. Refugees not only need emergency help, they also need to integrate into, or I rather say, become a full member of host societies. They need work, education, and housing. But what are the concrete effects of allocating more development funding for the reception of refugees? Does it come at the cost of other development funding for host communities? And what effect does it have on host states? Does the funding refugee reception form an incentive for them to become or stay inactive? These are troubling questions which I am not capable to answer. This is why I'm very much looking forward to the 3 sessions of today. In the first panel, we will learn about the social and economic rights of refugees as they are provided by the Refugee Convention. What are these rights? And to what extent are they being secured in practice? Marjolein Ziek, Lineke Slingerberg, and Kees Wouters will reflect on these questions. In the second panel, we will turn from law to politics. Alexandra Betts, Tineke Strik, and Gerald Kraus will discuss the recent European initiative to boost refugee reception in third states. What have been these initiatives precisely? How should they be assessed? And are they enough to substantially improve refugee reception conditions in developing states? In the final panel, we will discuss the actual practice of refugee reception programs. How do actors on the ground manage to operationalize broad rights regimes and policy programs in practice? I'm looking forward to hear from Sayed Malik, Xavier De Victor, and Kelsey Norman about their insights. Before I will give the floor to the speakers of the first panel, I would like to thank in the first place the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for initiating this conference and for pushing the subject. Tineke Strik just asked me, what a good subject, how did you come to find this? Well, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said you should do this. And of course, the subject is strictly speaking beyond our official mandate and field of expertise, but I just explained why I think this is an excellent subject. I also want to thank the Meijers Committee, especially the Meijers Committee members Maarten den Heijer, Saidja Rafi, Jorrit Rijpma, Janna Wessels, and especially Willem Hutte over there for their role in organizing the event. And finally, I want to thank the museum for Beeld en Geluid. I think so, something like image and sound. Thank you for the flexibility on all matters in this conference and for providing all digital techniques for today. Of course, I shouldn't forget the microphone then. Thank you for your attention. I wish you a fruitful conference, whether you are watching online or whether you join us in The Hague. And now we'll give the floor to Maarten den Heijer, who will be the moderator in the first panel. Maarten, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ashley. The first panel of this afternoon, we have 3 panels of which will each last 1 hour. The first panel is very much the legal one, in which we discuss the Refugee Convention and the socio-economic rights in there, and what exactly does that convention demand from states, especially in the region, but perhaps also from developed states in assisting them in terms of economic and social rights. And we hope we can reflect also a bit more normatively. It is a very old convention. Is it still up to date? And if we need to change it, what do we need to change it? Is it perhaps old in terms of content? But also, what about the scope of the convention? And the refugee definition is quite narrow, quite specific. Perhaps not everyone who is in need of protection falls under its scope. And then there is the question of supervision, monitoring, and enforcement, with a big role, important role of UNHCR, but we see that in many countries, especially in the region in South Asia and East Africa, many refugee rights are not respected. What can we improve in that respect? I think we have an excellent lineup in this first panel. Let me introduce all three speakers first, and then I give the floor to Marjolein Ziyech. Marjolein Ziyech, you are my colleague from University of Amsterdam, also a good friend. You're professor in international refugee law. You've published widely on the Refugee Convention and specifically on two issues, I think, the issue of resettlement and the issue of the role of UNHCR in supervising the convention. And I think I will also want to add that you are one of the few refugee scholars, at least in the Netherlands, but perhaps even in Europe, who is not focusing so much on refugees in Europe, but on refugees outside, where the most of them are. So I think it's perfect to have you as first speaker. We have two respondents, Dr. Lineke Slingenberg. She is from that other university in Amsterdam, the Free University. She has published widely on the perhaps a little bit more general issue of social rights of migrants, including irregular migrants and refugees. You're also the head of the Center of Migration and Refugee Law at the VU. You're currently associate professor, but we should congratulate you because you are appointed from the 1st of January as full professor in the area. On the very interesting chair, I should add, of migration and the rule of law. Our second respondent is with us online. I trust and hope he is with us. I see him. Dr. Kees Wouters, Senior Refugee Law Advisor at UNHCR, doing that for quite a long time. Before that, he worked on his PhD in Leiden, and I remember very well because I was in the same room working on my PhD. So welcome, Kees. Let us start with Marjolein Ziyech.
All right. Thank you, Maarten, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. I really like the subject, I must say, and yes, I do have the perspective from the global south, I suppose. I am affiliated also to a law school in Lahore, Pakistan, that may explain some of that outlook. I was given 5 questions that I should address today. And here we are. What does the 51 Convention demand from states regarding socio-economic rights of refugees? What are the limits of those obligations? Is the Convention rights regime still up to date? How are these rights protected in practice? And can refugees claim asylum in another state in case those economic and social rights are violated in their country of asylum? I will attempt to answer those questions under 3 headings: theory, practice, protection elsewhere, but in view of the title of the conference, securing refugee rights in the regions of origin, in whose interest and what rights, I will add another question: in whose interest. The first questions will be addressed under the heading of theory. What rights are we talking about, and why were they inserted in the 51 Convention? In view of the incremental structure of entitlement under the 51 Conventions, when are refugees entitled to those rights, and what are the standards of compliance? Based on the chapters in the 51 Convention, the relevant rights can be found in Chapter 3 on gainful employment and Chapter 4 on welfare. Chapter 3 consists of 3 rights: Article 17 on wage earning employment, Article 18 on self-employment, Article 19 on liberal professions, and I have it here. And our Chapter 4 consists of 5 rights: the rights on rationing, that's Article 20, 21 on housing, 22 on public education, 23 on public relief, and 24 on labor legislation and social security. Those rights were to enable refugees to become self-sufficient. That is, they would no longer be dependent on an international organization. In the words of the then Secretary General, who qualified the transition from the old regime, and then I'm talking about the regime of the International Refugee Organization, to the new one, the current one, in 1950, he said, and I quote, "This phase will be characterized by the fact that the refugees will lead an independent life in the countries that have given them shelter. The refugees will no longer be maintained by an international organization as they are at present. They will be integrated in the economic system of the countries of asylum and will themselves provide for their own needs and for those of their families," end of quote, and preferably on the basis of the 51 Convention. The need for self-reliance by means of improving refugees' access to livelihood opportunities is still high on the agenda, and I only have to refer to one of the key objectives of the Global Compact. This all sounds pretty straightforward, but the system of the 1951 Convention consists of an incremental system of entitlement, which means that not all of the rights comprised in the 51 Convention are immediately applicable. The 51 Convention distinguishes between various modes of attachment to the country of refuge, being subject to its jurisdiction, physical presence, lawful stay, and durable residence, and each right in the Convention is connected to a particular mode of attachment, and along with the passage of time and corresponding change in mode of attachment, the refugee acquires more rights. So the question should therefore be raised as to when those rights can actually be invoked by the refugees. The 8 relevant rights accrue to, and I have a slide here, respectively to physically present refugees, lawfully present refugees, and lawfully staying refugees. In case of a rationing system that applies to the population at large, physically present refugees, that is regardless of status determination or whatever, they're entitled to the same treatment as nationals. They're also entitled to elementary education. The right to self-employment accrues to lawfully present refugees, and lawful presence means being admitted to the territory of the asylum state, even if it's only for a short period of time. All the other rights apply only when the refugee is lawfully staying in the country of asylum, and lawful stay means officially sanctioned, ongoing presence in the country of asylum. There's not a requirement of a status determination or a formal declaration of refugee status. The next step is to identify what the various rights entail in terms of corresponding obligations, more in particular, what is the requisite standard of compliance. In case of rationing and elementary education, refugees must be treated on a par with nationals. It's different in case of the other rights and also with respect to higher education, none of which requires that the refugees are treated in the same way as nationals, but rather as aliens. In one instance, most favorable treatment accorded to nationals of a foreign state. At any rate, it means that the standard regarding refugees is lower than the standard that is applied to nationals. However, the relevant entitlements of refugees may be enhanced by comparable rights that are included in human rights treaties, most notably the 1966 Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. By way of illustration, reference can be made to the right to work, Article 6 of that convention. On account of time constraints, I will confine myself to the right to work, henceforth, since it's central to refugee self-sufficiency, and I think that is also the position of UNHCR, that is the centrality of the right to work. The right to work under the covenant accrues to everyone, regardless of legal status, so also to asylum seekers and refugees. However, the covenant also allows developing states to determine to what extent they will guarantee the economic rights recognized in the covenant to non-nationals. And this possibility affects possibly many, if not all, of the rights identified in the 51 Convention: the right to work, the right to higher education, the right to housing, and the right to public relief. And this is not just a theoretical concern. It was already mentioned in the introduction by Professor Terlouw. 85% of all refugees are hosted by developing states. So what countries are we talking about? And rephrased, which countries are currently hosting the world's refugees, most of the world's refugees? Here we have a slide, the source is UNHCR. The top 10 are Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, Germany, Sudan, Iran, Lebanon, Bangladesh, and Ethiopia. On this basis, the relevant regions would be Europe, depending on how one categorizes Turkey, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Of course, this list consists merely of a ranking based on numbers of refugees. A very different list would result if we would focus instead of the number of refugees that are hosted compared to the number of local inhabitants of the countries concerned. And I have a slide on that. We have a very different list. These are 8 states, but also to come to 10, I could add Guyana and Chad. But let's stick to the first list, leaving out Germany, of course, because that is not obviously a region in the country of origin of the refugees. A few observations about those top 10 countries. 3 out of 9 are not parties to the 51 Convention and or 1967 Protocol. Lebanon is not, Pakistan is not, and Bangladesh is not. Another one is, but it confines its obligations to European refugees, and I'm talking about Turkey. All 9 are party to the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. How are they doing economically, those 9 states? The GDP, gross domestic product, which is the scorecard of a country's economic health, the GDP of 2 states is under 40. And in comparison to the Netherlands, the GDP of the Netherlands is 914. Of 5 states, it's under 150, and of 7 states, it's under 300. It signifies that what those states are supposed to do as refugee hosting states is quite demanding when compared to their means, even if the standards themselves are not that exacting. On the other hand, enabling refugees to work in particular can benefit those countries, and Alexander Betts, I think, I'm not sure, are you sitting in the back? He will speak later. He has demonstrated that with respect to special economic zones for refugee employment in Jordan, that such projects can generate employment for both refugees and the nationals of the host state. In practice, the picture regarding the right to work is bleak. I do not think the picture is much better when we talk about the other rights, but again, I will confine myself to the right to work. The disconcerting overall picture is that less than 50% of all the states parties to the 51 Convention grant refugees the right to work. Less than 50%. One of the states that does not grant refugees the right to work is Iran, and that is a state on the list of the top 10 hosting states. Iran is a party to the 51 Convention, but it made, when acceding to the Convention, simply a reservation to a number of articles, including the provision on the right to work, indicating that it considers those provisions as merely recommendations. And rather incongruously, it did not make any reservation to the 1966 Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Other states of the top 10 list that are parties to the 51 Convention perform better. In Colombia, refugees may work, yet struggle to access the labor market. Uganda has a self-reliance policy that allows refugees the right to work and freedom of movement. In Ethiopia, since recently, refugees have the right to work on a joint project with Ethiopian nationals, and they also may fill positions which cannot be filled by Ethiopian nationals. Sudan also grants the right to work to refugees, but due to restrictions on the right to freedom of movement, accessing employment turns out to be impossible, and it forces refugees to continue to live on food assistance. As to states not parties to the 51 Convention, and I include now Turkey because it does confine its obligations to European refugees. In Turkey, Syrian refugees may work, but the requisite work permits must be requested and paid for by employers, as a result of which, in essence, refugees are forced to access the informal labor market, which means a high risk of exploitation, abuse, and low wages. As to the states that are not parties to the 51 Convention, but parties to the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Bangladesh, Lebanon and Pakistan, refugees are not allowed to work in Bangladesh. To survive, many seek employment illegally, as a result of which they are exposed to unfair and unsafe work conditions, harassment, exploitation and extortion. In Lebanon, most refugees are denied the right to work, but Syrian refugees may work, but only in 3 low-skilled sectors: agriculture, construction, and cleaning. In Pakistan, lastly, refugees do not have the right to work. One of the questions that was posed to me as a question I should address today is whether the Convention's regime is still up to date. The standard of compliance of the social and economic rights is not exacting. Yet a substantial number of states parties appears not to observe the right to work. This seems to me to point first and foremost to a problem of non-observance of treaty obligations rather than anything else. And my counter question, and perhaps I should put that question to Kees Wouters from UNHCR, what is UNHCR doing in response by virtue of its supervisory responsibility with respect to all those states that do not observe their treaty obligations? The last question I was asked to address pertains to the violation of economic and social rights by states hosting refugees. Can they, on that account, successfully claim asylum elsewhere, in another state? Merely failing to meet the human rights standard will generally not be enough for an asylum claim. That will only be the case if that failure can be construed as a form of persecution. I think that will be very hard to argue. An alternative yardstick that could be used to answer this question are the resettlement submission categories UNHCR applies. Categories that are used, among other things, when resettlement functions as a so-called tool of protection. That is, in essence, to secure a second country of asylum. One of those categories consists of legal and/or protection needs, and that includes threats to fundamental rights in the country of refuge. In order to qualify, the threat should amount to rendering asylum untenable. The source, by the way, of this information is UNHCR's Handbook on Resettlement. Even if this could be argued, and it's a big if, there are too few resettlement places, so it's a no-go. Less than 1% of the world's refugees can be resettled. And that means that resettlement will not or cannot be an alternative to violations of economic and social and cultural economic and social rights in the country of asylum. Another solution is required, and that brings me to the last question. Securing rights, refugee rights in the regions of origin is in whose interest? Obviously, I would say first and foremost, it is in the interest of refugees. They are entitled to basic human rights either on the basis of the 51 Convention, 1967 Protocol, and/or equivalent treaties and human rights treaties. However, 85% of all refugees are hosted, I did say it, by developing countries. A percentage that is indicative of the fact that the responsibility for the protection of refugees is not shared evenly or equitably, and on top of that, UNHCR suffers from severe underfunding, so not able to compensate that either. Responsibility is not shared evenly or equitably. To the contrary, I have 3 slides with some relevant figures on the slides. I think that should change. All the lofty ideas about responsibility sharing, most recently in the Global Compact, should be implemented to secure equitable responsibility sharing. I'm not contending that the insufficient lack of observance of economic and social rights by a substantial number of states is due to large numbers of refugees, even though that is of course a factor. And it should also not serve as an excuse to disregard treaty obligations either. But the fact is that the states who can least afford it carry a disproportionate part of the responsibility that should not solely be theirs, merely on account of geographical proximity to countries of origin. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjoleine, for a not overly optimistic introductory speech. I think it's very important that you highlight the importance of the right to work. From whatever perspective you look at reception in regions of origin, it's all about refugees wanting to build a new life, wanting to become self-sufficient. And even if we do not agree, as Ashley does, with one of the aims of reception in the region being the prevention of migration. I think one of the key motivators for refugees to move on is simply that they are not allowed to build a life in the country of refuge. Before we move on to Lineke, one message for the people at home, and that is that you can communicate with us. I have a magical tablet on my lap, in which I can see the questions you put to us on the chat. So after the speakers, we will have room for some discussion, questions also from you here present, and debate. Lineke, can you please go to the lectern?
Yes, so good afternoon. In my response to the interesting lecture of Professor Ziek, I would like to focus mostly on the what question. So what rights are provided by the Refugee Convention? I would like to zoom in a bit further on some of the provisions of the Convention, since I believe that they can provide particularly strong protection for refugees, sometimes even surpassing the protection offered by general international human rights law. However, I will also conclude by noticing that the Convention also leaves an important protection gap, and that on that issue in particular, international human rights law provides important additional protection. So, what are, in my view, these strong elements of the Refugee Convention as regards social and economic rights of refugees? First of all, and I will illustrate it and explain it a bit more in the following slides, but it's about the general standard of treatment that is provided under the Refugee Convention to refugees. It's about the way the equal treatment provisions are formulated. It's about that there are also a number of, I call them flanking rights, so other rights that are important for the protection of your socio and economic interests. And finally, the relevance of the lapse of time that is inherent in the convention structure. So the first one is the general standard of treatment that is laid down in Article 7 of the 51 Convention, and it requires states to accord refugees the same treatment as is accorded to aliens generally as the basic requirement. So this does not entitle refugees to the rights that are reserved by treaty for citizens of countries with which the asylum state has a special kind of relationship, for example. But it does entitle refugees to the general facilities or benefits that might be available in a certain state for non-nationals in general, which means it is not possible under this provision to exclude refugees or asylum seekers only based on their refugee or asylum seeker status from certain general minimum benefits in a country, like homelessness, shelters, or whatever. So it's not possible to say refugees are not allowed to enter if other kind of non-nationals can enter. So it is an important minimum, very minimal standard of treatment. Secondly, the way the equal treatment provisions or the rights to refugees are formulated. As Professor Ziek already told us, every right laid down in the convention has a different standard of treatment that is required. And there are two examples here where national treatment is required. So the first one is public education, elementary education. Which is to be accorded to all refugees, irrespective of whether they are lawfully present or lawfully staying or not. They should be entitled to the same treatment as nationals as regards to elementary education, which is a very important safeguard, of course. Another example is Article 23 on public relief, which is social assistance. There again, it's national treatment, but then only for lawfully staying refugees. Well, I think these rights are particularly strong because in legal doctrine you can make a distinction between equal treatment provisions of the open model or equal treatment provisions of the closed model. And equal treatment provisions of the open model are formulated in a very broad way and generally prohibit discrimination on a number and an open list of grounds. So, for example, the International Convention on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights prohibits discrimination on the ground of color, race, national origin, and other status. Well, such an open formulation means that a difference in treatment is prohibited unless it can be objectively justified. That's how such a general and open provision works. On the other hand, provisions of the closed model, like those in the Refugee Convention, prescribe who should be regarded as alike, in this case refugees and nationals, for which specific area, in this case education and social assistance, and specify sometimes some explicit exclusion. So in this case, as regards social assistance, it's refugees who do not yet stay lawfully in the territory. For such, if they are formulated like that, no other justifications can be brought forward for a difference in treatment. So in that sense, it gives a much more stronger kind of protection for refugees as compared to a general non-discrimination provision. The third issue were the flanking rights, as I called them. One example is freedom of movement. It was already mentioned also by Professor Ziyech that freedom of movement is something that often is restricted for refugees. Sometimes refugees are provided with housing often in camp-like structures, not only in regions of origin, also in Europe. And usually that kind of provision of housing is coupled with severe restrictions on the freedom of movement. So, for example, curfews, reporting obligations, fences that close at night, etc. Even though the convention only provides the right to housing to refugees who are lawfully staying, it does provide protection against such restrictions on freedom of movement for refugees who are not yet lawfully staying. So for refugees who are lawfully present, it requires, it grants the right to freedom of movement and to choose a place of residence in the same way as aliens generally in the same circumstances. But also, and here that's an example of how the Refugee Convention provides more protection as regards general international human rights law. Also for unlawfully staying refugees, there's some protection in the convention as regards their freedom of movement, because Article 31 requires a necessity condition. So it's on to the state to show why such a restriction is actually necessary. Another example is access to courts, which is provided to all refugees. And for refugees who are habitually residing in the territory of the asylum state, it also grants them the same treatment as nationals with regard to legal assistance, which is a very important right. And residence, it's phrased like habitual residence, just residence does not require lawful residence. Residence requires a sojourn in the territory for a certain amount of time. It does not require permanent settlement. And the addition of habitual means that the country with which a refugee has the strongest ties is the country of habitual residence, in case a refugee has two countries of residence. So that's not something that is that common. So this is a very important right. Legal assistance, it means it's more possible for refugees to also get access to their rights and access to legal remedies. A final example is identity papers that should be provided by states to all refugees. And that's, of course, often a condition for acquiring other kinds of benefits. Then finally, the lapse of time is relevant in the Refugee Convention. There are two specific examples where the Refugee Convention explicitly refers to a lapse of time. 3 years of residence, simple residence, so no lawful residence. There's an exemption from legislative reciprocity. That's a very technical term. I'm not going to explain that right now. But also, and more importantly, no restrictive measures imposed on aliens or the employment of aliens for the protection of the national labor market may be imposed after 3 years of residence. So that's a very important right that refugees have. It also accrues to refugees who have a spouse or a child of the nationality of the country of asylum, but also after 3 years of simple residence. So this is an indication that after some time there should be an increase in rights. And it has also been argued that it could mean that if states do not have status determination procedures, or if after 3 years there's no status, the procedure is not yet finalized, every refugee should be treated like they are lawfully staying in the territory. So it could be an indication for such an interpretation. Okay, I conclude with, as I said, noticing also an important protection gap. The socio-economic protection of refugees pending status determination, when refugees are just entering the territory, is not that well protected by the Refugee Convention because of these qualifying conditions of lawful stay that are at stake with regard to the right to housing, the right to social security, the right to enter the labor market. So on those issues, I think general international human rights law can provide very important additional minimum protection. So while the Refugee Convention does not protect the first basic needs of refugees who just arrived, it does provide important rights that protect refugees' autonomy by protecting them, their freedom of movement and their access to identity papers, access to courts and education. And it does provide important protection for refugees whose residence in the state of asylum takes a bit longer by providing these strong equal treatment rights. So let's keep these more hidden gems maybe of the Refugee Convention in mind when discussing its relevance. Thank you.
Thank you, Lineke. I think it's indeed very good, and both of you do that to point out that the system and the structure of rights in the Refugee Convention is quite different from general human rights treaties, not only because it depends on the level of attachment to the state, but perhaps even more importantly, it depends on some kind of idea of equal treatment, in most cases, in most rights, with nationals, and sometimes also with aliens. And the outcome of that, of course, means that the level of human rights protection under the Convention differs per, I guess, country of refuge, and also the situation the individual is in, which perhaps makes it also far more difficult to make generalized statements about violations of the Convention. Perhaps Kees Wouters can help us with that, because he is the senior refugee law advisor at UNHCR, and he's with the Division of International Protection. So I guess, Kees, the UNHCR has two tasks. One is, let's say, assisting students in countries of refugees, but your job at UNHCR is to checking whether states comply with giving them the rights as they should under the Convention. Good to have you here. You have the microphone, Kees.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to the organizers for allowing me to be present, although not physically. It's good morning for me, quite early in New York, where I am. Apologies for not being there. I see that you're sitting nicely and comfortably in your leather chairs. I'm on a wooden stool in my small room. I should also apologize, I guess, for saying that I won't be deviating much from what the previous speakers have mentioned. But I will try address some of the questions that are posed to me, to UNHCR. But I also would like to start again with numbers, and I know they've been mentioned, but it's important to put things into perspective. We are counting close to 21 million refugees right now, and as was mentioned, 85% of them are hosted in developing countries, 27% actually in the least developed countries. And 75% of refugees are hosted in countries neighboring their countries of origin. So it's important to have these numbers out there again. In my 10 minutes, what I'll try to do is not become too much legally technical. I think Lineke Slinkenberg has done that perfectly. But I'll go back again to some more broader issues and try to outline some values that I think the Refugee Convention has. I'll focus on 3 values and then address the realities that we as UNHCR see on the ground and what the responsibility of UNHCR is to addressing these realities. So going to the Refugee Convention and the value or the values it has in addressing the struggle that countries have with hosting refugees, particularly developing countries. The first value, and again, it has been said already, but what the Refugee Convention very nicely does is understanding the predicament that refugees find themselves in. I very much like to look at the 51 Convention as a package of rights, aiming to ensure that refugees are resilient, that they can rely on themselves rather than having to rely on the host state, or at least too much having to rely on the host state. So we shouldn't see the Refugee Convention as a mere list of independent rights, as we may sometimes see other human rights instruments, but actually as a package, as an overview of rights that relate to each other. To give you an example, and again, this has been mentioned, identity documents free movement is an example in point. That works alongside welfare rights, employment rights. As a recent report showed that UNHCR issued, looking at how the Global Compact and some indicators that we've identified in the Global Compact, how they have been applied in countries, particularly in developing countries, we do see that a lot of problems when it comes to refugees accessing the labor market not so much exists in terms of the legal framework in these countries, but exists because refugees do not have freedom of movement, do not have the proper identity cards, and because they don't have proper identity cards, they cannot, for example, open bank accounts or access bank loans, which they need to start a business. So it's important to understand Refugee Convention as a package of interlinked rights that actually starts with the essence of refugee protection, which is protecting them from forced return, the principle of non-refoulement, ensuring that those who need international protection are protected as refugees, followed by some key rights speaking to a refugee's dignity, recognition as a person, as to who they are, and then focusing on their development, their welfare, and finally facilitating a durable solution for them. So that's the first value. The second value of the Refugee Convention is really that it addresses states. It requires states to treat refugees as part of a community, and progressively viewing and treating refugees as eventually citizens of their own country. It was mentioned already, the 51 Convention prescribes these levels of treatment for refugees that states must adhere to. A level indeed that is relative. It depends on the legal status that the refugee has in the host country, and it is connected to the treatment of others, progressively from non-nationals or aliens generally to most favorably treated non-nationals, and eventually to nationals. That relative aspect of the 51 Convention and the provisions of the 51 Convention is not necessarily a hindrance. The way UNHCR very much likes to view it, it's actually it actually requires states to gradually treat refugees as full members of their society. To give you an example, when it comes to asylum seekers, indeed their protection by the word of the 51 Convention is limited because they generally do not have a lawful stay in their host country, and yet we do see or we do advocate for states to allow asylum seekers to have access to the labor market as soon as possible, but no later than 6 months. That's a policy argument, obviously we're making, not a legal argument. Although with the help of international refugee law, and I'll come back to that in a moment, we can build a legal argument for allowing asylum seekers to access the labor market as soon as possible as well. So the fact that the 51 Convention prescribes these levels of treatment and progressively or encourages states to gradually treat refugees as full members of their society, the 51 Convention is not a standalone instrument, and it really must be read and applied in combination with other instruments, most importantly, human rights instruments. And when we talk about socioeconomic rights, obviously, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but also, for example, labor law standards, the ILO conventions, the ILO recommendations. And it's important to look at these instruments because in many ways they determine concretely what the content of the various rights that refugees have, and indeed everyone else has, and what the obligations of states are. And that brings me really to a third value of the Refugee Convention. No, before I go to the third value, maybe one point to mention where international refugee law is important, and particularly the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, is that when it comes to gainful employment, access to the labor market, Article 6 of the Covenant makes very clear that states must take deliberate, concrete and targeted steps and make continuous efforts to stimulate economic growth and development, aiming at reaching full and productive employment for everyone, not just refugees. And that is important because it will benefit, of course, access to the rights in Article 17, 18 and 19, the rights to gainful employment in the 1951 Refugee Convention. I've got 2 minutes left, and I've got much more to say. So let me quickly go to the third value of the Refugee Convention, which is really that it also understands the predicament of many states that host refugees. Already, as you may know, the preamble acknowledges that the granting of asylum may place unduly heavy burdens on certain countries, and that states need to cooperate with one another. And that element of international cooperation is again part of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and perhaps even stronger because it's part of an actual provision, Article 2.1 of that covenant, requiring states to take steps individually and through international cooperation to assist and cooperate with one another. So that's again an important element, and the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has clarified that this leads to concrete obligations for states. I refer to General Comment number 3 as well as to a more recent from 2017 recommendation of the Committee on Duties of States toward Refugees and Migrants under the Covenant. Now, the realities are, of course, much different, and I'm looking a bit at my notes and trying to end up or trying to conclude. The realities are, of course, different, and we see that developing states hosting refugees are struggling both vis-a-vis refugees as well as vis-a-vis their host countries when it comes to socioeconomic rights. And UNHCR has a clear role to play in that regard. First and foremost, it means that we need to ensure that there is a proper legal framework available in the host countries. Professor Zieg mentioned that 50% of countries hosting 85% of the world's refugees have a right for refugees accessing the labor market in their laws, but it means that still 50% don't. And we need to, as an organization, advocate for stronger laws. Now, one of the things that I think we've managed to do better in recent years is that we're not just focusing on the asylum laws or the refugee laws, but also focusing on other laws when it comes to employment, labor laws, when it comes to education laws. So it's important to look at the framework as a whole. I think the other important role that UNHCR has in the Global Compact on Refugees is an example there, is to facilitate and team up with partner organizations, being it UN organizations, for example, in the context of employment and access to the labor market, the International Labour Organization, or, and the Global Compact again is an example there, with development actors. And you will speak later on, and you'll hear from my colleague on the work that we do with the World Bank. But that's, I think, a very important role for UNHCR as well, is facilitating these partnerships and ensuring that these partnerships actually have a concrete task and approach in countries hosting refugees, for example, through the development of national policies and national programs. So going beyond the actual laws, but actually through implementing instruments in these countries. I guess in the interest of time, I'll leave it there. There's much more to say about this, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kees, for this UNHCR's perspective, and also forcing us to look at other treaties that are relevant as well than the Refugee Convention. I also observed that all three of you mentioned two specific rights: the right to work, the right to labor. Kees was speaking about it intensively. You two did as well, and freedom of movement. So apparently, I got it from you that at least in respect of those two rights, the international community should do much more to make the convention effective. We do have some time for questions, but first, perhaps Marjolein, because you were the first speaker, do you want to respond shortly to what Lineke and Kees have been saying?
Well, I think we very much agree, but I would like to say something to respond to something what you said about the variation of standards among different countries. But I would like to emphasize that there's also the beauty of the 51 Convention, because it means that it's not imposing higher standards than would be granted to the nationals of those countries, which they could not implement anyway. And it is a real concern. Just a small anecdote, I was in Uganda a few years ago, and we had a gathering with government officials, and one of the questions they posed was about the perception that the convention appeared, that's what they thought, appeared to demand a higher standard than what they granted to their nationals. So I was very happy that I had the opportunity to explain it's not, but I mean, it is a concern. Another point I would like to mention is that it is also a matter of assisting those hosting states. And let me add how important that is, also in terms of seeking asylum. Just before the Taliban, a few weeks before the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, Pakistan indicated that it could not afford to have another wave of Afghan refugees, and still 3 million in the country. They cannot afford it. They said it time and again, and I thought it was an open invitation to the international community, do something. No one stepped forward, and what is the result? The borders are closed, and still they're closed. So, I mean, this is a consequence. And a third thing I would want to say is that it is very obvious that states, whether they're parties to the 51 Convention or the Covenant, at any rate, all 9 of the top 9 hosting countries, or 10, including Germany, are party to the Covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. That means they have to observe the right to work. They don't. They don't. And why is that? Because I think there, some research should be done, or has probably been done. One of the things is, of course, the fear that those refugees will compete on the labor market. Perhaps we should be able, it must be able to demonstrate that labor and projects will benefit the host state as well, that it is not something, what this diminishes whatever is available for the host population, but that it adds something. And I think if you can demonstrate that to refugee hosting countries, I think that would be a very big step forward.
Thank you. Let me now proceed with the question. There was one question that came in from the audience at home during your presentation, Kees, and it is a bit of a technical, legal question, so perhaps I should ask it to you, from Dennis Diepenhorst. Should any violation of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights also be taken into account when assessing the violation of socio-economic rights? And Dennis points to the danger of material deprivation. Is that something you are concerned about? Are you in UNHCR looking at the European Convention when it comes to reception in the region?
Not really. We're not really looking at Article 3 violation when it comes to reception in the region. We are looking, and that is, I guess, because we do think that when it comes to the reception of asylum seekers and refugees in these countries, in these developing countries, which are mostly obviously outside or only outside of the European and the Council of Europe region, it goes beyond, let's say, the destitution that is inherent in an Article 3 violation. So that states have a responsibility to treat them and not merely ensuring that to treat them better, not merely ensuring that they are they're facing destitution and in that sense being treated inhumanely, but that they do acquire an adequate standard of living as the International Covenant prescribes, that they can have access to the labor market. So I'm failing kind of to understand where the question fits in terms of looking at the obligations that states have, developing states have, other states have, in terms of treating refugees and asylum seekers.
Yeah, but perhaps I can rephrase it. When it comes to issues of material deprivation, we have heard of some rights, but what are the specific rights in the Refugee Convention that deal with that issue, material deprivation?
Well, I guess the most concrete rights that deal with that would be the public relief, Article 23 of the Convention, Social Security, Article 24. Those would come closest to it. But I would also say that the welfare rights, gainful employment rights that the Convention includes, speak to this, and they all, as I said, it's a package, and they all speak to the fact that we certainly cannot leave refugees hanging, cannot leave them in destitution, but actually should make them self-reliant and should empower them to provide for their livelihoods by themselves.
Clear. Let me turn to the audience present here. I am now planning to take a few questions from you, if you have them, and if so, please raise your hand, and Willem will come to you with a microphone. Ashley has a question. Foreign Affairs has a question. Yeah. Just take them in.
You have a question? Yes, sir. You have a question?
So I will first take some questions, 3 or so, and then give the word to the speakers.
Thank you. So my name is Anu Zelis. I work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a senior policy advisor on development approaches to forced displacement. So basically on that, as Professor Zijk said, part of our work is actually really trying to create conditions in which refugees are indeed seen as an economic asset and a social asset. So that's part of the logic of development approaches to forced displacement. And I wanted, so it's a kind of a comment, but it's also a question comment, as usually is in these occasions, is I wonder where this political will of countries, hosting countries, actually come in to support or to strengthen the legal, the implementation of the existing legal framework. And how can the outside actors support the UNHCR and support the hosting countries in creating that will? And I'll give you an example. At an event that I attended, there was a Colombian representative who quickly came up with the description. Okay, well, you know, refugees cost us 0.5% of GDP annually, the Venezuelans, right? We calculated that they bring 0.9% GDP growth, so we have a bit of a, you know, so in principle it would be fine in the long run if you could assist us with this 0.5 GDP sort of that we need to invest into them, that would be great, thank you very much. And that was a government that really had political will to use the means that were available to it to create an asset, right? There are governments that we are supporting where that political will is missing. And so so that's my question. How can you know, where is that element? How do you create that political will?
Is this question, I think it's best to be answered by Marjolein and Sieg, right? Yeah. Let's pick up 2 other questions.
It was a little bit of a technical question, maybe to Tineke, that you said something about if there is no status determination within 3 years, there is a de facto lawfully staying kind of, well, I wonder in how far that actually happens and how can you be lawfully staying in a de facto way? I haven't got it. I do.
And Ashley, you also had a question.
Yes, stand up, okay. Just a very short question. How can you have access to justice as an international court for the Refugee Convention is lacking if one of those social rights is violated?
Good question. I think at least, Lineke, you said something about it, so you may be well placed. Marjolein, the first question was addressed to you.
Well, first of all, I like the approach you are mentioning, which is being taken by Foreign Affairs. The political will, I would say, first of all, but I'm a lawyer, you know, they have treaty obligations. I mean, states should be reminded of what it implies. I also think the Colombia is willing and did, of course, do a lot for the Venezuelans, regularizing their status and so on. I think political will or the willingness, preparedness to adjust laws or to implement treaty obligations may very much be dependent on tangible help. And I think, again, Pakistan is a case in point. I mean, it clamored for help. You know, it did expect a wave of Afghan refugees. They said they cannot afford it, and they know what they're talking about. They're hosting millions already for 40 years. So I think political will, or let me rephrase it in more legal terms, the preparedness to do a bit more to implement your treaty obligations may be helped when there's substantial help from the outside world. And I think also acknowledging that those states are hosting the bulk of the refugees. I mean, look at Bangladesh. I mean, it's hosting, you know, almost a million of Rohingya refugees. There's no end in sight. They live a dreadful life. Bangladesh has no money. I mean, what do we expect? I said a very sad answer, I fear.
Lineke.
Yes, so the convention does not require states to have status determination procedures, but there are authors, for example, James Hadaway, Alice Edwards, Hema Bartjes, who argue that if states do not have status determination procedures, the convention does not authorize states either to withhold all those rights from refugees. So, because then you would just do not status determination and you wouldn't have to provide all these gradual rights. So they usually argue, so this is not something that is very clear in the convention, but it's like interpretation and in legal doctrine. They generally argue that if you do not have a status determination procedure, refugees should, you should assume that refugees are lawfully present, and then after some time, and perhaps 3 years is then used as an indication because it's used in the convention itself. Those refugees should be considered to be lawfully staying. And in the Netherlands, we used to have also a similar kind of policy. So that if, but that was that's another situation. So this was an answer to if states do not have a status determination procedure at all. It can also be that they have such a procedure, but it takes forever. And then as well, you can use this 3 years ID maybe to say that if it takes more than 3 years, there should be some increase in rights. And that's the kind of policy that was actually in the past present in the Netherlands. Access to justice, yes. So there's no international tribunal, but you do have, of course, the national court. So, and I know there is some interesting case law. For example, the South African Supreme Court has excellent case law on access to employment based on the Refugee Convention. So it does happen, but that's then the only way. But I think this legal assistance element in Article 16 that I had on the slide is important there.
We need to wrap up so quickly, Marjoleine.
I just wanted to refer, just supplementing Lineke, that we also have the treaty body of the Economic and Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, and it did say something about the right to work and refugees and asylum seekers, but if I recall it correctly, in the comment by Craven, the committee is not really pushing, in the sense that, states, you should adjust your laws. So something else, I mean, that committee should be pushed a bit harder, I would say, but it is there.
Is there anything you want to add, Kees? Obviously, UNHCR is also a supervisor, but it's also a protection provider. Does that not conflict with one another?
I want to say a few things on the access to justice. First and foremost, South Africa was mentioned by Lineke, but also Kenya. Actually, we intervened in a case in South Africa on access to the labor market, and a case in Kenya, access to the labor market, both for asylum seekers, where we try to advocate and make the legal point also that that asylum seekers, because of their lengthy stay in the country, should have access to the labor market. Just to say a few things about the political will, there is no easy answer to that. I think, and it links a bit to the point that Professor Zieg also made. I think we do not understand well enough yet the contributions that refugees can actually make to host societies and host communities. I think we're starting to understand it, and I know Professor Betts will speak in the second session, and he'll probably speak to that. But I think there's more to be done on that front to really make to really understand what assets refugees can bring to host communities. That providing them, for example, access to the labor market doesn't necessarily mean that they're there to stay forever. But that it can also facilitate other durable solutions beyond, let's say, local integration. On the point about the sometimes difficult or the tensions that may exist between UNHCR as a protection agency and a supervisory agency, yes, they are undoubtedly there. I do think we've managed to very well in many instances to overcome those tensions. And the fact that we do provide assistance protection on the ground does not necessarily prevent us, for example, from intervening in court cases and advocating for a stronger legal framework and a stronger implementation by the states taking on their obligations and responsibilities.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot to all the speakers in this panel. We break for 10 minutes for coffee, and then we reconvene for the second panel. is een laptop en die moet je niet uitzetten, dat deed.
as you know, and as I've seen, there's a huge gap between the debates and papers that are being drafted and what happens on the Polish-Belarus border.
approaches. So whereas the first session had the very strictly kind of legal perspective, this one will delve into the policy aspects of the question of socioeconomic rights in the regions of origin. And as we've heard, as the previous speakers have made clear, the vast majority of refugees are in the regions of origin and in developing states, and those states struggle to provide rights, socioeconomic rights to them, as well as to their own citizens, right? And in recent years, EU institutions and member states have renewed their efforts to improve refugee reception and inclusion into host societies in those regions of origins. And so what we want to do in this session is look at these approaches, these policy initiatives that aim to protect refugees in third states. What kinds of initiatives are there? How can we assess them? What do we think of them? In whose interests are they being implemented? So these are the questions we're addressing. Like in the previous session, we'll have a keynote speech of 15 minutes followed by 2 respondents of 10 minutes each, and then some time for discussion and questions and answers afterwards. All right, so without much further ado, let's get started. I want to introduce the keynote speaker for this session, Alexander Betts, who is joining us online from the UK, I assume. Hi, Alex. It's good to see you. I've known Alex for over 10 years now. Many of you will know him too, of course. He's, of course, one of the key figures in this particular topic, and of course, his work has already been mentioned in the previous session and preface. So Alex, I'll introduce him anyway. So Alex is Leopold Muller Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs, as well as William Golding Senior Fellow of Brasenose College at the University of Oxford. He is one of the key figures of the Refugee Studies Center at the Department of International Development at Oxford, and served as its director for a number of years as well. And yeah, so the reason we have invited him as the keynote speaker for this session is, of course, that he's probably the expert on political economy of refugee assistance. And he has written widely about the topic. I looked it up. You almost published a book every year since 2009. It's pretty impressive. His most recent one is The Wealth of Refugees, How Displaced People Can Build Economies. And that was published with Oxford University Press this year. And in that book, Alex argues that the key to better refugee policies lies in unlocking the potential contributions of refugees themselves. So here we pick up nicely from the last comment made by Kees Wouters in the last session as well. So Alex, it's a great honor to have you here. And yeah, I invite you to deliver your keynote speech. You have 15 minutes. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to join you. And my only regret is that I'm not there in The Hague in person. I would have liked to have traveled, but for the circumstances around COVID-19. Hopefully you can see a PowerPoint presentation that I've shared, but I've been told I can't control from here. Is that the case? Fantastic. So hopefully to the person changing the slides for me, it will be fairly obvious when I need to change, but I'll also try to indicate it very clearly. To get things started in this very important conversation, I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the insights from my recent book, The Wealth of Refugees, How Displaced People Can Build Economies. The title of the book is obviously a play on the title of Adam Smith's 1776, The Wealth of Nations. That book was arguably one of the founding treatises of modern economics. But I think what's happened in the subsequent 250 years is that economics has paid very little attention to people who fall outside the framework of the nation state, whether as exiles or refugees, for instance. And yet refugees have economic lives. They are producers, consumers, entrepreneurs, and it's important to take that into account. A lot of the research in this book draws upon the research of the Refugee Economies Programme based in Oxford, and it tries to speak to a variety of themes and disciplines in the way that Adam Smith was also not just an economist, but also thought about politics, policy, and ethics. The key guiding question in this book is a really challenging one. It's what are sustainable refugee policies, and what should they and what can they look like for the decades ahead? So could I have the next slide, please? The book then has a particular framing. It covers ethics at the start to ask what should refugee protection look like. It then covers economics, what works, then politics, what persuades, and policy, what next. So it's trying to cover those different elements. But really it's focused on protection and solutions in the so-called global south, the refugees and development agenda, as it's come to be known over not just recent times, but many decades. Next slide, please. And the premise, there are two premises to the work, which I think will resonate with most people here. The first is that we live in what I call an age of displacement. By that, I mean something simple. We have rising numbers of displaced people around the world, but on the other hand, declining political will to support immigration and asylum, not just in rich countries, but also around the world. We have rising numbers. We have 82 million displaced people around the world, some 26 million of whom are refugees. Those figures seem to increase year on year with UNHCR updating its statistics, but also we face significant challenges around fragile states, climate change, that are likely to be accentuated over time. So this is a challenge that is not going to disappear anytime soon. On the other hand, we also face declining political will. And we see that in the policies and practices of not just European states, but a range of governments around the world. And there are trends underlying that may suggest that this will be politically challenging for the foreseeable future. The shift in the distribution of capabilities in international order away from US hegemony towards the rise of China, the rise of BRICS, means that the UN Security Council is often polarized, our ability to engage in root causes is challenged, and international consensus around political action isn't always there. Equally, there are changes in the international political economy around automation, offshoring, that make full structural employment in the global north increasingly challenging, which puts pressure on the politics of immigration and asylum as immigration becomes a polarizing issue, but also a scapegoat issue for many politicians. So the age of displacement is the first premise. To the next slide, please. But my second premise goes in a different direction. It's the recognition that refugees can be contributors. There is no inevitability that refugees should be a burden on receiving societies, whether in the global south or the global north. They have skills, talents, aspirations. If they move to rich countries, it may require upfront investment in education, vocational training, integration, but in all parts of the world, they have the potential to contribute economically, but also socially and culturally. And these images show just some of those contributions in one context, the Kakuma refugee camps in Kenya, contributions from entrepreneurship to the arts, to sport, to agriculture, for instance. Can I have the next slide, please? So I begin the book by thinking about ethics. What do we mean by sustainable refugee policies? And I begin by situating this in non-ideal theory, in political theory. And that's the idea that we need to take into account political constraints into our ethical understanding of the world. That we have to see, for instance, nation states as a core institution in political theory, and nation states are often accountable to their citizens, and that creates a certain threshold on what we can aspire to achieve from an ethical perspective. But nevertheless, I've outlined 3 criteria for sustainability: rights, politics, and scale, and suggest that sustainable policies have to meet all 3 of those criteria. In terms of rights, they have to deliver protection, assistance, and solutions. In terms of politics, they have to build consensus at the local level, the national level, and international level. Without consensus, without a democratic mandate, policies will not endure. But they also have to exist at scale to provide for increasing numbers and endure over time without incurring significant domestic political backlash or international backlash. And I suggest there are 3 broad allocation mechanisms for refugees to achieve sustainability, and that all of them are important: spontaneous arrival asylum, resettlement, including complementary pathways, and support in neighboring countries. All of these have an important and in some ways unique role. All rich countries should contribute to all of them. We have to leave the door open in terms of spontaneous arrival asylum as an important last resort for people who might also become refugees sur place. We can't substitute away asylum in Europe, for instance. Resettlement is also crucial for people who have been in protracted exile for a long time, who have particular vulnerabilities, or to unlock opportunities, and complementary pathways are an emerging way to achieve that. But I argue that for the majority of the world's refugees, they will remain in neighboring countries of first asylum, that around 85% of the world's refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries, and for most, that's the immediate neighbor. And so we have to retain an important focus on that and do better than we currently do. Assistance levels are inadequate, solutions are available to a tiny minority of refugees, funding is far too little for purpose, and ideas such as refugee camps are outdated. So where I go with my research is to try to reimagine what protection and assistance can look like in those neighboring countries. Next slide, please. And I focus particularly on 3 countries: Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. And while this might seem just one region of the world, East Africa, it's a region that hosts roughly the same number of refugees across these 3 countries as the whole of the European Union, around 2.8 million at the time of the research. It's a country that has hosted and received about the same number of refugees at the moment as the United States has received over the last 50 years. And I look in my research, together with my team at the Refugee Economies Programme, at one major city, the capital cities of these 3 countries, but also one group of camps or settlements in each country: Nachibali in Uganda, Doloado in Ethiopia, Kakuma in Kenya. Next slide, please. And we've collected an original and randomly sampled data set covering over 16,000 refugees and, importantly, host community members from different nationality groups across these contexts. Somalis being common to all the sites to allow comparison, Congolese across some of them, but also some other populations, Burundians and South Sudanese appearing in some of the sites. And we've complemented that with impact evaluations, looking at some of the pioneering initiatives like the Kalabaye settlement in Kenya, like the Doloado camps and their cooperatives model in Ethiopia, to assess what's worked in terms of market-based approaches and under what conditions. Next slide, please. One crucial thing to note is we use participatory methods. So around 300 refugee and host community research assistants have contributed to the work. We've sequenced qualitative work, including focus group interviews, in-depth interviews with members of the community, ethnographic research, with then leading to quantitative research so we can understand communities. And part of what we've tried to do is recognize that the audience for our research is not only the wider international community, but also the communities themselves. And so to translate at least some of our work back into languages of those communities and present it within the communities so it can be useful. Next slide, please. In brief, we asked 3 sets of questions from that data set: welfare, social cohesion, and mobility. And I argue that these are 3 empirical questions that are particularly important for understanding sustainability. So welfare: when do refugees thrive rather than merely survive? what explains their income levels, their subjective well-being, food security, physical and mental health. Social cohesion, when do refugees and host communities get along? What shapes host community attitudes towards refugees? And mobility, when do refugees stay or go within the countries that host them, within the regions they're in, or indeed internationally? Next slide, please. And what I want to do is not just outline each of those, but if I could go to the next slide, please, to also give you just 10 brief insights into some of the key findings from that work. So key findings that are useful for academia, but also policy about making protection work in the global south. So the first thing is the poverty trap. We find that refugees are generally worse off than the host community in terms of income, assets, food security, subjective well-being, physical and mental health. There is a systematic source of deprivation as a result of being refugees. The one notable exception for that in our data was in Turkana County in Kenya, and that's because the local host community is particularly poor. Next slide, please. The second area I want to emphasize is around social cohesion. We find that increased intergroup interaction between refugees and host communities, increased contact, as it's known in the literature, often increases and improves host community attitudes towards refugees and vice versa. Particular forms of contact matter, notably economic contact. Consumption relationships, employment relationships can make social cohesion better. Intragroup attitude formation also matters at a very local neighborhood level. So the attitudes of family members and immediate neighbors are correlated with those of people who hold views towards refugees. We also find it's the economy rather than identity or security that's most important. And there are key differences between cities and camps. Camp host communities are often more receptive than urban communities. Next slide, please. Thirdly, we find that the right to work matters. We're able to compare the Ugandan model with the Kenyan model and statistically show that holding other factors constant, the Ugandan self-reliance model of the right to work and freedom of movement make a difference. For instance, controlling for other variables, the Ugandan model is associated with 16% higher income at purchasing power parity for refugees. Next slide, please. Fourthly, we're able to show patterns of migration and mobility. One of the key features of our study was being able to go back to the same refugee populations at a 2-year lag in Kenya and being able to ask neighbors where those who had left had gone. We also looked at migration aspirations, and we found that while a significant majority of refugees aspired to move onwards internationally to Europe, very few did. There was high levels of mobility. Every year, a significant number of refugees move, but mainly within Kenya, mainly between camps, within camps, between cities, or if they move internationally across the border to Uganda. A tiny minority actually move to rich countries, around 0.1% in any given year. The aspiration is there, but the movement is not taking place. We also found some evidence, the so-called migration hump, that looks at the migration development relationship appears not to apply to refugees. Next slide, please. And briefly to go through these, fifthly, we find limitations in terms of self-reliance initiatives. We've done impact evaluations in Calabaye and Doloado, and we find that existing self-reliance initiatives often circulate aid money, but don't build productive capacity. In Calabaye, after 2 years, newly arrived South Sudanese refugees rarely had independent income generating activities or regarded themselves to be self-reliant. Next slide, please. Sixthly, we find that cash-based assistance is working to some extent in Calabaye, but we find nuances to that the shift from in-kind assistance to cash has also carried debt burdens with it. And often that means that the freedom of choice you'd associate with cash is not realized because of pre-existing debt. Next slide, please. Seventhly, cities versus camps. It's not that one is necessarily better than the other for refugees. Refugees in cities have higher incomes, higher asset levels, higher employment rates, but we found systematically they have lower subjective well-being and often worse physical and mental health. It's also important to note that refugees are not necessarily selecting one or the other predominantly, but they often adopt particular strategies for selecting between urban and camp, even splitting families and households. Next slide, please. 8, income levels. We've identified what determines whether refugees are better off in particular areas: employment, education, networks, gender, nationality, host country, or matter. And gender here is, I think, particularly worth underscoring. Next slide, please. The ninth area is the cooperative model in Doloado, which I think is a pilot of something that could be taken forwards. With funding from the IKEA Foundation, group-based income-generating activities have been designed across the camps. Some have been very effective, others less so. But there's evidence that these group-based income-generating activities in agriculture, livestock, for instance, have been particularly important in improving income levels and relations between refugees and host communities because they involve both refugees and hosts. The key to success has been market-based linkages and value chains. And 10th and finally, next slide, please. One key element that we found is transnational livelihoods matter. Not only remittances, but cross-border movements are key to refugees' livelihood strategies. This image is of the Somali-Ethiopian border, and there's a lot of back and forth movement, often invisible to the international community, that's important. Next slide, please. The very final thing I want to leave you with is that politics matters for all of this. What I've tried to do in the book is look at what's shaped Uganda's self-reliance policy, not just recently, but since independence. It's had support for self-reliance, but for complex political reasons, linked to political interests at the national level, but also in local refugee hosting areas like West Nile and the southwest of the country. We need more political economy analysis, more high quality political analysis to look contextually at the drivers that lead to support for self-reliance policies, to understand them, to recognize them, to invest in that analysis and ensure we work in a context-specific way. Next slide, please. And to conclude, what I've said is we have rising numbers, but declining political will. All areas, asylum, resettlement, and neighboring countries are important, but we need to reshape our policies for neighboring countries. They have to be evidence-based in terms of refugees and development. There are limits of how we currently conceive self-reliance. We have to move from microeconomic interventions to macroeconomic to understand the politics of the right to work. And a key final thought is we can do more in these regions to support refugee-led governance. Self-reliance focuses on the economic dimension, but political self-governance, support for refugee-led organizations is also important. I apologize for going slightly over time. Thank you very much to whoever has been controlling the slides on my behalf.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks very much, Alex, for this very interesting insight into your most recent work. And I found it particularly interesting to see how you approached the topic from this non-ideal theory lens, and to see how also from your work it emerged that which we had as a kind of common thread in the previous panel, that the right to work and the right to freedom of movement are particularly crucial. So I think there's lots to discuss, and we'll do that immediately with our first respondent on this panel here today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Tineke Strik, even though she, like Alex, barely needs any introduction, I'm sure, in this circle. So Tineke is obviously one of the most prominent and engaged members of the EU Parliament on matters of refugee protection, also protection of minorities and rule of law, and many of you will know her from that context. But what maybe not everybody knows is that Tineke combines her political work also with academic work. So she's also professor of sociology of law and migration law at Radboud University in Nijmegen. In the European Parliament, Tineke has served as rapporteur on the EU external migration policy, also on the Return Directive and the Frontex Scrutiny Working Group. So she has very much inside knowledge on of the political processes behind how those instruments are created. And I'm sure she can share some insights from that perspective as well. So we've learned from Alex kind of what and his book and his work what's required for things to that they can work, right? And so I'm curious, what does the EU do in order to try to contribute to this? Tineke, you have about 10 minutes. You have the floor.
Oops. So I don't need to take him, eh? This is fine, okay. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks a lot, Alexander, for your inspiring keynote speech. I do not completely react on you because, well, I just hear now your presentation, so I already prepared something. And I think while we celebrate the anniversary of the Refugee Convention, it's important to underline that the spirit of the Refugee Convention is clearly a common responsibility for the refugees worldwide. It's already mentioned by Case, for instance. The obligation to cooperate is clearly there in the Refugee Convention, but also the whole objective of the Refugee Convention is a spirit of taking this responsibility together. And also from an ethical and normative perspective, that would be the only answer. Given the geographical situation, it's a matter of coincidence which country has to host most of the refugees. And these are often the developing countries, what has already been reiterated, of course, 86% of the refugees. And maybe that's not completely coincidence, as we see that wealthy countries are protecting themselves against having to take care of refugees, even if they come from a neighboring country with deterrence, fortressing, and outsourcing policies. And I think also for practical reasons, this common responsibility is the only way forward, because if not, host countries under pressure will fail to take sufficient care of refugees, which will affect the level of protection, will deprive refugees from a new future to build, and that, of course, inevitably will lead to further mobility for those who can afford that. They will start moving to a place where they can have a future, especially for their children, and I think this is clearly what we saw in Turkey 2015. And furthermore, fragile hosting countries with a disproportionate responsibility may even turn into a refugee-producing country itself. So if wealthy countries generally want to avoid dangerous routes to be taken, they should take responsibility and see that also as their own responsibility, that refugees in the neighboring countries in the neighborhood have sufficient future perspectives. But I think it's not clearly anchored in the legal system, this common responsibility, because this is still very much connected to the territory. So only if there is a jurisdiction, which is in any case applicable if people are on the territory of a state, the legal obligations of the Refugee Convention apply. And this may have triggered even strategies to avoid this responsibility, which we clearly see with externalization. So financial support and resettlement are still a matter of choice. And that often leads to late and slow responses to support refugees fleeing a new conflict, but also to promises or pledges being not fulfilled in the end. And this also means that funding depends on priorities of states, on political preferences, which makes the capacity in hosting countries very insecure. And that deprives them of the possibility to really invest and have long-term strategies in order to substantially improve the situation of refugees and to make them to enable them to become resilient. And I would therefore argue, I don't know how, I mean, we really need a lot of political will, that we need a global refugee fund to which every state contributes in proportion, so which would operationalize this common responsibility and at the same time enhance access to social rights for refugees so that they can study, work and integrate. And I think what Alexander also said, and also in the previous panel, becoming self-reliant is so vital for the dignity and autonomy of refugees. And another advantage would be that the funding would not come at the cost of development aid, what we see happening now, which would mean that development aid is withdrawn from countries with not a high migrant interest or from other sectors in certain countries. But letting refugees integrate in countries with a high level of poverty or unemployment is also not easy. I mean, although it's a right in the Refugee Convention, we are completely aware of this now, access to the labor market is difficult to enforce, which was already also reiterated, but it's difficult to enforce from outside. It is a sensitive issue. Funding could work, perhaps, as a positive incentive for hosting countries to open up their societies for work as well. I mean, on the one hand, indeed convincing, like what Alexander explains with the successful projects, of which also communities benefit. But I think if we have a predictable, sustainable source of funding, then it would be more easy to also have as a condition that the funding would be used in the interest of refugees in securing basic rights and basic needs, but also access to the labor markets and possibilities for entrepreneurship. And that would require that we do not make funding conditional on all other things, on things that are in the interest of EU states or other Western states, like conditionality on readmission, on border controls, on return policies. I think it would be really smart and good to focus this conditionality or sort of the leverage for the interest of the refugees themselves. And also, I think we have encouraging examples, like with Jordan, that we can also open up or give more trade benefits if refugees are included in certain labor sectors, so that they can really see that it also benefits the whole country. But of course, I think it should be clear with funding alone, we cannot sell the responsibility. This is not a common responsibility ultimately. Societal public support in neighboring countries, and this is also the problem with giving access to the labor market, is not a given. It needs to be preserved. I mean, Western politicians often say, well, we have a lack of societal support, but this is also an issue, of course, in hosting countries. And that other states share in the responsibility physically also is of vital moral support in that sense. And UNHCR always estimates that approximately 10% of the refugees in the region are too vulnerable to stay there, that they should be resettled in order to get sufficient care. And actually, that should be the first group, I think, should be prioritized by the West. But if you look at the figures, they are pretty depressing. I mean, we are now 1.5 million people on a waiting list. Last year, there were only 34,000 people being resettled. So the political will, which was already said by Alexander, is decreasing. And we saw the resettlement forum on Afghanistan. Now the EU promised EU member states to have approximately 40,000 pledges, which seemed good, but they're already lagging behind with pledges they did already before. So we really have to see how much it will be operationalized. Alexander also mentioned complementary pathways. We can do a lot more with that, specifically simplified family unification, humanitarian visas, but also scholarships and labor migration. This is very much relying on the member states, and this is also very much driven by their own economic interest. That's not a problem as such, but you could still prioritize the refugees who are skilled or could be become skilled. I think I found it interesting that Alexander mentioned the right to mobility, because I was also thinking, especially regional mobility, giving refugees the possibility to go to places where they can find work, where they can employ themselves, would really be a regional impetus for the economy, but of course also foster their chances. If I think of the ECOWAS region, which is a free movement area, what we see now is due to our agreements from the EU with specific countries there, that this regional mobility seems to decrease instead of increase. So I think that should also be a concept that we should think about more. Okay, so what do we see in policy? I already mentioned the externalization. The Global Compact was actually meant to reinforce this common responsibility, but we see clearly that the leverage is used, that we use the leverage, the conditionality for our own interest, which goes at the cost of development aid purposes, of democracy, rule of law objectives that the EU also has. Yet there's also no sequence, the right sequence, because we may give additional money, not only development money, but there you see that there's more structural funding of border controls instead of funding and investment in protection systems, which is more on an ad hoc basis. And I think the right sequence would be that you first make sure that there is a specific level of protection in a transit country before you enter into cooperation on readmission and return. I see I already have to wrap up. I want to say something about the report that the European Parliament made. I think it's an important step that the European Parliament made clear that there should be human rights impact assessments before entering into cooperation on migration, so that you know what may be the impact for refugees or migrants, that it should be properly monitored in a transparent way, and that also not all funding can simply be made conditional. We have negotiated for the big new fund, the NDGI, that only 10% can be made conditional upon migration cooperation. And that funding should also be much better scrutinized than it does now, so to make sure it doesn't lead to human rights violations and that it complies with the right priorities. And I think finally, it is so vital that the EU invests in a real equal partnerships on migration, taking into account the interest and the needs of third countries in a positive way instead of with the agenda to outsource, because in the end that will create harsher migration policies and people ending up in a legal limbo. So also take into account the needs and rights of refugees, because for the moment it's about combating irregular migration, but not so much about the people that may be affected by that cooperation. So I think the more win-win the cooperation is, also the less vulnerable the EU might be for instrumentalization, which is at the moment the big concern for Western countries. And I think the only credible way to promote and demand respect for fundamental rights is to give the right example, of course. So by upholding the right to asylum ourselves at the borders, on the territory, Alexander mentioned that as well, and by holding violating actors also accountable. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Tineke, I think you raised many important points here. Among them was the importance of funding, of availability of funds, and obviously that was an important element of the EU-Turkey deal, and that leads me to the introduction of the final person or member of this stellar lineup that we have on this panel, and that is Gerald Knaus. Gerald Knaus, who came to prominence mainly as in recent years, mainly as the architect of the EU-Turkey deal, right? So Gerald is the founding chairman of the European Stability Initiative, which is a non-profit research and policy think tank that focuses on Southeast Europe, Turkey, and the South Caucasus. He's now based in Berlin and coordinates field research and also provides strategic analysis to European policymakers. More recently, in 2019, he was appointed by the German Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development to serve on a commission in charge of drafting recommendations on how to address the causes of displacement and migration. And he's also an author. In 2020, he published the book Welche Grenzen brauchen wir? Which borders do we need? On the future of asylum and migration policy. So Gerald, we're very curious to hear your perspective on the possibilities for securing refugee rights in regions of origin. You have the floor for 10 minutes.
Yes, well, thanks a lot. Like Alex, I would have very much preferred to be in The Hague now. It's always a great place for these discussions with all the expertise in the Netherlands. And I'm glad that we have at least now this chance to discuss. At a moment, you know, you've pegged this conference to the Refugee Convention, 70 years, at a moment when this Refugee Convention really looks in enormous trouble. I just come to this now from another Zoom debate where I was talking to Polish friends on the Polish-Belarus situation. This is very different, but I just want to start with one basic point, which is on the trends in recent years, and offer you perhaps a different perspective to the one then useful for the debate, to the one offered by Alex and Tineke, on trends in the world when it comes to refugees in recent years. And secondly, I would like to say something that actually builds on what Tineke was outlining, the idea of how to increase reliance, self-reliance of refugees in third countries. And thirdly, say one word on something that Alex also raised, which is on legal ways and resettlement. But let me start with a different take on the very same numbers. We always hear that in debates on migration, and especially on refugees and displacement, that the number will rise. It's 82 million displaced in the world. It's 26 million refugees. That's sort of the consensus that literally almost any debate I go to, it's assumed that that is a reflection of reality. Well, have a look at what these numbers really tell us. Alex referred to the 26 million refugees. Well, I would not count the 5.6 million Palestinians as reflecting any trend, because these are the descendants of the descendants of the descendants who left before the Refugee Convention was even signed. At that time, there were 800,000, now there are 5.7 million. Their number increases every year because they have children in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Gaza. If we look at trends, let's look at the 20 million refugees without the Palestinians. The 20 million refugees under UNHCR's mandate, if you check for the Global Trend Report 2017, it's 20 million. If you look at the Global Trend Report 2020, it's 20.7 million. So in the last 4 years, the number of refugees in the world, according to UNHCR, increased by 700,000. And if you look in the last Global Trend Report, I think it's page 8, on the number of children born as refugees, UNHCR tells you that it's around 320,000 a year. Now, these are children born in Turkey or in Germany or in Sweden or in Lebanon or in Jordan or in Uganda. So 320,000 people become refugees in the statistics because they are born. But in 4 years, the number in the world only increases by 700,000. What is happening? The answer is obvious. For the last 4 years, refugees don't manage to cross borders in significant numbers. The trend in the last 4 years is that borders are closed. Now, think for a second about the borders we know. Europe, the US, the borders around Afghanistan, the borders around Syria. Who gets out? Who goes anywhere? What we actually see in the US, just the last fiscal year, which ended September this year, most of which under President Biden, there were 1.7 million apprehensions of irregular arrivals at the US border, 1.7 million, the highest number since the 1960 fiscal year. But you only had 24,000 asylum decisions, and only 9,000 people received protection in the US. So 1.7 million apprehensions, 9,000 received protection. More than 1 million pushed back under a rule that Donald Trump introduced. Now, I don't need to tell you about Europe, except that this is the moment at which I fear European leaders are going to legalize pushbacks. We had a debate on Poland, which legalized pushbacks. That's just what they did with their law on the 25th of October. And you don't hear a word of protest from any government when the same law passed by Hungary still led the Commission to do an infringement procedure. At the moment, everybody's praising Poland for controlling the border. But what they are doing is pushbacks of children, of men, of women, of families. You grab them, you put them back into Belarus. So the point about trends is that at the moment, I'm not sure there will be many more refugees if this trend is not reversed. Now, what does that mean then for the future of the refugee system? Well, if people, the majority of displaced who grow are internally displaced, And if you look at the trend, where did refugees find refuge in the last 8 years, since 2013? 8 million, no, sorry, 9 million more, 11 million in 2013, 20-something million in 2020. Where are these 9 million? Well, Alex pointed to East Africa. There are 2 million of those new 9 million refugees. Most of them are in one country, in Turkey. Turkey took in a third of all the new refugees in the last 8 years worldwide. And then 1 million is in Germany. But Turkey and Germany are very hard to reach now. So the challenge then is, how can we get countries to actually let refugees in? And Tineke pointed it out. If Europe and America are engaging in pushbacks, where in September this year, America under President Biden pushed back 100,000 people in 1 month to Mexico and some to Haiti, well, then other countries are not going to be inspired by the European example. But the second question is, what do we do with the refugees that are already here? The 3.5 million in Turkey, the 900,000 to 1 million in Lebanon. Talking about those that are even close to Europe, where the interest-based argument can be made that we have an interest in integration. Well, look at Turkey. When Greece started introducing pushbacks as a systematic policy in March 2020, the pressure in Europe to give Turkey more money to help the integration of refugees disappeared. 6 billion to fund healthcare, social support, education of 700,000 children in schools, not in camps, mainly in Turkish schools. But then once Greece put its cards on pushbacks and not cooperation with Turkey, it's very hard to mobilize money. There's talk, but there's no real decision to give Turkey more money to help the integration of what is the single largest number of refugees in the world. And that is the problem. And Alex pointed it out, the political realism. If Europeans and Americans and others in the world decide pushbacks are the solution, then the argument to help with sustainable solutions, with integration, which are the right case, the right cause, the right case to make, will become more difficult. Because people say, wait, pushbacks work. So what is to be done? Well, first of all, we should show, and I agree with Tineke, we should show where are there today refugees in need. It's not an overwhelming number. It's not growing fast, but there are refugees in countries that cannot cope without support. Now, this is not 50 million. This is not 20 million. Many of these 20 million are in countries like Turkey, America, Canada, Germany, Sweden, and Uganda, South Sudan, Bangladesh. I'm talking now about those that were actually displaced in the last decade, in the last 8 years. We should find ways to help them and show that first countries of first reception are going to receive the support to integrate them. We know that the 3.5 million refugees in Turkey are not going to go back to Syria. It would be horrendous to push them back, even to try. So where is the call, the strong call to make this a success of integration? At a moment when the Turkish opposition is actually beginning to use that as an issue in the elections, promising Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, the leader of the opposition, if he wins elections in 2 years, all the refugees are gone. So let's mobilize resources. Let's show that integration can be a success. And let's be serious about resettlement. Because if people can no longer cross borders irregularly, well, then resettlement becomes even more important. And I don't have the time to go into details, but perhaps in the debate, I wrote this book, as you've said, where I outline how realistically you might get to 250,000 places of resettlement in the world each year without burdening any one country too much. And given the real refugee numbers, not the mythological ones, this would make a huge difference, not a small one. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the debate.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Gerald, for this very engaged intervention, in particular pointing out the risk of an apparently increasing acceptance of pushbacks, indeed, undermining the principle of non-refoulement. We have, I think, only a few minutes now for discussion. So start thinking up your questions. Also, the people online, you're free to type them into the chat. They will pop up on my little what do you call this again? And I'll read them out. But before we do that, I would like to give Alex the opportunity to briefly react to the respondents if he wishes. Alex.
Thanks, Jana. I think we're in broad agreement. I think what Tineke articulated very clearly for me was that we need to set a good example of how we respond to refugees here through asylum, through resettlement, through not just closing our borders and externalizing asylum. And we need to invest significantly in packages that will support host countries around the world that are win-win, that support self-reliance, moving it beyond the limitations of the current framing and implementation of self-reliance. And it's that balance. It's how we get right what we do here to set a good example while investing seriously in first countries of asylum. And I think that balance was very clearly articulated by Tineke, and Herald seemed to agree a lot with that. I think the idea of a global refugee fund is very compelling and interesting. I think in a way that the current variant of that is the deeply inadequate funding that goes to UNHCR at the moment. Its operations in terms of humanitarian support, its engagement with development assistance are inadequate compared to needs. Somewhere there needs to be a massive gap filled, not just in humanitarianism, but also the development assistance that support jobs and public services for refugees and host communities. The West has to take seriously that funding level has to increase. I think it's right that we need to create win-win packages for host states, looking at particular contexts. Jordan is different from Turkey, is different from Uganda. What's going to work in one country is going to be different from another country. I think it's absolutely right to critically engage with the data and statistics that we commonly accept in relation to refugees, in relation to their distribution. Of course, the percentage of refugees in the world is a tiny proportion of the world's overall population. It's about 0.35%. So we do need a sense of perspective, albeit that those populations are geographically concentrated. I think we have to remain skeptical of UNHCR data, but equally there's evidence that even outside that data, people who are in displacement situations are often moving outside the channels that capture those numbers. Irregular migration is becoming significant. People who move for so-called mixed migration reasons from areas like the Northern Triangle, from Venezuela, are not necessarily being defined as refugees. They might be seen as migrants, they might be viewed as externally displaced, but there is significant evidence of displacement around the world that is also not captured in that data. So I agree very much with the framing and the challenges. I also think there were some very interesting points that we heard from Herald about Turkey in particular, and hosting over 3.5 million refugees on Europe's doorstep, and yet the really impending and often ignored challenges around ensuring integration and the sustainability of that, because all it will take is a change in the political climate in Turkey, and that could tip the balance in terms of onward movement. So I think this is at risk of being an echo chamber of agreement. I enjoyed both sets of comments. There was little with which I disagree.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alex. I see that we received a first question from the people online, and that's directed at you, Tineke, and actually picks up on what Alex just said. So the question comes from Ruben Wissing, and he asks, how would the proposed global refugee fund differ from UNHCR budget? So maybe you can explain a little more on that.
Well, I think it would be good to I think that the way UNHCR is funded now may be too permissive, so to say. I think we could make it broader, more obligatory, and also take into account all the needs of the refugees. So not what you see now, funding always comes too late or is too little, also for UNHCR. And that means that we cannot go further than, limit ourselves to basic needs. Whereas where we're talking now is really making investments in education, in schooling, in labor market skills, etc., then you need to have much higher ambitions, also with such a refugee fund, and making sure that all states are contributing in proportion. Of course, you could take UNHCR funding as a first step, but I think it would be good to expand it and to have a more, let's say, predictable system of it, so that not also UNHCR enters into troubles.
Great, thank you, Tineke. I think we do have 4 minutes, so if there's any questions on the floor, we can take them. I can see, both Jorrit and Martin. Maybe we can take both of them and then make a last round of comments from the panelists. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. A question thanks, by the way, for all 3 presentations. My question is for Alexander. I'll make sure to ask your book for Christmas. A compelling model you are presenting in your book for improving the protection of refugees. You did not speak too much, and I invite you to do now on the actors who should make this work, who should make your model work. What is the role of the European Union? What's the role of UNHCR? What's the role of our foreign ministry, for example?
Thanks, and now we have a question from Jorrit Reitma.
I just had a very quick question. We're talking here about policy, and I haven't so far heard anything on the Global Compact on refugees, and perhaps also even its interaction with the Global Compact on migration. I was wondering, does that play any role? What relevance should we give to that? And I was also wondering whether the book has already been translated from German into English, but.
Right, should we just give everyone the chance to briefly respond? Maybe going in reverse order, maybe. Gerald, do you want to start?
All right. Well, very quickly, some chapters have been translated, and I'm translating more, which those that have been translated, I send a link to the organizers. You will also find them if you Google humaneborders.eu. Humaneborders.eu. You find some of the data I was referring to. On the Global Compact, for refugees. Well, it was passed by 181, I think, countries in the General Assembly, except Viktor Orban's Hungary and Donald Trump's US. And then these same countries turned around and started doing the exact opposite. It's supposed to be about increasing resettlement to help countries of first reception. It's decreased to the lowest number in decades. It's supposed to be upholding the right to asylum and the Refugee Convention. Well, it's being broken openly in the US, in Europe, in Australia, and elsewhere. So I fear it's a very good document. I really think this Global Compact on asylum, on refugees, is a very good document. I quote it a lot as the sort of intellectual and especially political roadmap, because so many agree to it. The trouble is, what's missing is the interests to make it work. The political interests in democracies or other countries that have the resources. That's the problem. But of course, that's just a challenge for all of us to keep insisting.
Thanks very much, Gerald. Tineke, would you like to?
Indeed, it is a very important reference, and we should actually make more use of it so that it becomes a more lively instrument, I would say. And I think also the monitoring at the moment of the implementation has a very low profile. No one actually knows exactly to what extent it is being implemented, and there's a lack of enforcement, of course, what Harold also said. So, but as politicians in political arenas, us. We should use it more, I think, and also see how we can strengthen the meaning of it, and at least show, and this is also the question of Marta, what are the actors? It's a question to Alexander, but I think at least that the EU should take a leading role of taking this common responsibility. What you see now is the reverse way. I think we are a bad example, because actually we more or less also trigger that transit countries are applying the same externalization policies as we do, with as a consequence what Gerald was also saying, people can hardly even flee from their own country anymore. Look at Syria, look at Afghanistan. And my last remark on Afghanistan, I found it pretty embarrassing that van der Leyen on the one hand promised 1 billion euros for the Afghan refugees in Afghanistan and the regions, whereas the neighboring country said, but we already have enough refugees, we're not going to do it. And at the same time, the Justice and Home Affairs Council only made clear in a declaration they all have to stay there. We should not take any measure that could be implied as a pull factor. So it's just giving money, instead of really looking at ways to safeguard sustainable protection for everyone. And this is really the bad example, because why should another country who is already under pressure take that challenge then?
Yeah, thanks, Tineke. We're out of time, but Alex, you shall have the opportunity to also comment quickly.
Very briefly, I think the Global Compact on Refugees is important because it has intergovernmental consensus. And it brings to the fore the question of responsibility sharing, on which refugee law is not entirely silent, but largely quiet. I think, though, we can't expect too much from it. It outlines the importance of the durable solutions, which obviously, as we know, people are not getting access in large numbers to resettlement, repatriation, or local integration. And then it puts self-reliance on the agenda. And I think it's created an intergovernmental consensus around self-reliance being the go-to solution. But we need to go beyond that and actually translate self-reliance into something that creates meaningful and dignified lives for refugees in host countries around the world. And that's where the related comprehensive refugee response framework that's now closely tied with the compact is important. And many of the questions that we're looking at in our research around refugees and development, around self-reliance, looking at case studies like the Kalabaye settlement in Kenya, like the Doloado camps in Ethiopia, like the Ugandan self-reliance example, and trying to look at evidence of what works and under what conditions, I think are an attempt to add evidence to the core of what the Global Compact is trying to achieve. We need that evidence base to know what's going to translate those aspirations in the compact into sustainable outcomes, but then it needs backing. Tineke highlighted that with UNHCR's funding model, it's discretionary and voluntary contributions for the most part, and we don't have binding ways to support responsibility sharing. Countries that are distant from countries of crisis and conflict have discretion. We in Europe predominantly, if refugees don't reach our territory, have discretion over resettlement, have discretion over our financial contributions. The GCR needs to be a step in the direction of shaping consensus around what an appropriate level of contribution can and should be. In terms of the actors, obviously there are different roles that particular actors can play in achieving this. The European Union contributes through its funding and through its policies, through the way in which it balances asylum in Europe, which is obviously very important, with the external dimensions of European policy. And we've seen with the EU Trust Fund focusing on Africa, that many of the programs that I've looked at evaluating have been funded by the European Union Trust Fund. That trust fund and things like it can be used to support development-based approaches for refugees, but be packaged in ways that leverage policy change around the right to work and freedom of movement. UNHCR continues to play a crucial role in terms of expertise, humanitarian relief. It has other areas where it needs to work with others to achieve and deliver.
I'm so sorry that I have to interrupt you, but it's popping up in red that we have to wrap up. So it pains me to cut you off here, but we have to have to wrap. Can you finish your sentence maybe? And then
yeah, and in terms of what the role of the ministry in particular, I think governments obviously have a role as donors to fund, but it doesn't have to end there. Facilitation is important. Playing a convening role that facilitates political bargains with first countries of asylum is a significant contribution that foreign ministries can play through their analysis, through the convening role, and through delivering bilateral deals that include not just humanitarian aid, but development assistance, trade policy, etc. That's a way to change policy and practice in first countries of asylum.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It was a privilege to be here with such distinguished speakers. This concludes our session. Please join me in thanking all three of the speakers. We have a 10-minute break, by the way. 10-minute break. 5 minutes, sorry.
5.
That's my fault.
Yes, thank you very much, and welcome to the third session of this conference, of this workshop today, organized by the Meijers Committee and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I welcome everyone here in the room, obviously, back, but also online. If you could see me sit here, this is sort of the sad face of the pandemic. There's a moderator, and I'm talking to our stellar lineup, waiting to present and to give their contributions to this third panel. And the idea of this third panel is very much that we look into the operationalization on the ground of what we have seen in the first panel, the legal parts and the policy part in the second panel. How does that come together on the ground? And who better to ask for a keynote presentation there than Sajjad Malik, who has over 30 years of experience within the UNHCR. He's currently the director for the Division of Resilience and Solutions at the UNHCR, but has experience across the globe. Importantly, he was previously in Damascus, in Syria, at a particularly challenging time. And it's therefore a great honor that I can virtually welcome you, and I look to the screen now, that I can virtually welcome you here to The Hague. Mr. Malik, you have the floor. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having us. I heard the earlier panel, so please allow me to repeat the figures again, because it was important to put the context right. I'll try to see if I can capture some of the key messages here. So generally, we have been saying that we have been facing the worst forced displacement crisis since the World War. For the last 10 years, it's been consecutively on the rise. The numbers have doubled over the last 10 years. I think it's important to put that in perspective, refugees as well as internally displaced and other forcibly displaced. Now, we have not only been seeing the rising numbers of forcibly displaced population over the past decade, but also seen an increasing number of displaced people stuck in protracted situations. Many more refugees are coming out, many more forcibly displaced are getting more and more stuck in protracted refugee situations. We have also seen that majority of world's refugee populations are settled in lagging, underdeveloped regions in developing countries. Regions that are deeply affected by fragility and extreme poverty. And you'll see many more examples that we have seen heard this morning from other panel members, but also we can see in other data that is coming out. Each of these regions are struggling to meet their own development needs. We have seen Dadaab refugee camps that are almost now 30 years old. We saw Kakuma in the earlier study from Christopher, is also about 33 plus years old. And there are many more displacement. Syria is now in its 10th, 11th year. Rohingya refugees are going into the 6th, 7th year. And most refugee situations are becoming now protracted. Now, accommodating the sudden arrival of masses of newcomers present a challenge for host governments, as these are underdeveloped areas, poverty, not enough services, and they have to host refugees. And we also heard the number earlier, and I'll just repeat it, that more than 85% of the world refugees are hosted in developing countries. And that's a fact. I think it's important to recognize that. So I'll try to speak to some of the recent approaches and tools that we have designed to support the socioeconomic rights of refugees. Recognize the recent displacements and trends and challenges brought about by the COVID has also done a lot of additional burdens on these host communities. Inclusion and integration in host community offer the most realistic opportunities for protection for millions if it can be provided. The problem generally is that refugee problem is often been seen as a humanitarian challenge. The refugee potential is never recognized to contribute to the development of the host communities and host societies. And they're just seen as a recipient of humanitarian assistance. There are many, many examples where the potential of refugees has not been unblocked. They stay in this protracted situation for decades, potentially blocked and not used for the development of their own human development, but also development of their host communities and societies. I would also quickly come back to what the earlier panel also discussed, is the General Assembly adopted the Global Compact on Refugees. I think it's important to recognize that. And that was done in December 2018, talking about the burden and responsibility sharing. And that's an important aspect because we let these poor, underdeveloped regions, host communities, hosting refugees for protected situations, and only on humanitarian assistance. And that's not burden and responsibility sharing in the true spirit. So in line with the Global Compact on Refugees, UNHCR has strengthened its partnership with development actors to advance socioeconomic development opportunities for refugees and their hosts. And it's important to include the communities that are hosting refugees in that. By supporting humanitarian assistance transitioning towards more development activities, inclusion, international services and programs. To be honest, until the point when GCR came about, UNHCR has been trying for decades to get the development actors to engage meaningfully in forced displacement. Yet, it took a combination of events. The most important one was the Syria crisis and the large movement of refugees towards Europe, as well as conversations around the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration. This brought in a renewed focus on forced displacement as also a development challenge. In 2017, the World Bank provided a helpful analytical framework that clearly put displacement on the development agenda. And they did this piece. This is my colleague who is on the call right now, was the architect of that piece, which was titled as Towards a Development Approach Supporting Refugees, the Internally Displaced and Their Hosts. This paved the way for a number of policy initiatives and financial instruments. Arguably, the biggest game changer, we strongly believe that the World Bank's decision to include forcibly displaced in the development agenda. It established its Global Concessional Financing Facility in 2016 to respond to Syria refugee crisis. Jordan and Lebanon benefited a great deal from that, but also in the 18th replenishment of the IDA, the creation of refugee sub-window, which then became window for hosts and refugees in the 19th IDA replenishment, dispersed close to over $7 billion to respond to refugee situations from 2016 to date. So the concept here was that the more countries hosting refugees and thereby providing a global public good from socioeconomic developments, the higher the likelihood that refugees will benefit from the socioeconomic development opportunities. We lent UNHCR its full support, working together with the World Bank colleagues, with the host governments, to advance refugee inclusion and protection through assessments of the refugee protection framework, identifying key protection priorities, and full support for the design and development of IDA 18 and IDA 19 finance projects. One of the tools created to help measure progress in the refugee policy review is the Refugee Policy Review Framework, which commonly is now known RPRF, which is an IDA deputy requirement for accessing IDA 19 funding. It is not meant to compare or contrast countries. It is simply there to monitor changes in policy landscape, recognizing refugees to have greater socioeconomic opportunities and live with greater dignity, unblocking their potential and working closely with the host communities. Arguably, this new tool used the World Bank, host governments, and UNHCR can now equally be used by other like-minded development actors to better channel and direct development financing. Other multilateral development banks, regional banks, and bilateral actors have been growing in the engagement to respond to those challenges. Just to give a few examples, EU's INPA, is now a very strategic partner on forced displacement. Just recently, they've issued formal instructions to all EU delegations on the same line. Netherlands is a very strong partner in the prospects program that we have with that. Germany has been supporting DAFI scholarship for nearly 30 years now, and their BMZ is also contributing quite strongly in this domain. OECD is working on data on making sure that we have inclusion specified there. Just one example, if I can give, we have talked about access to jobs and markets, freedom of movement. One right that I would also like to highlight is the education of refugees. Currently, only 68% of children go to primary education. This number drops to 34% when it gets to secondary education, and it drops further to 5% when it comes to tertiary education. So if you can imagine the millions that we talked about, even if you can unpack it in different countries, 68% to primary school, 34% to secondary, and only 5% go to tertiary education. And this is when we talk about unblocking potential, education becomes extremely important here. Now, COVID-19 has also had a huge impact on that. We made good progress, but this COVID-19 impact has also had on refugee hosting countries a major impact, socioeconomic, and they're struggling to meet the ends meet on this. But COVID also opened up the opportunities, and UNHCR is working hard to make the case for inclusion of refugees in health services and COVID vaccination plans. 130 countries have included refugees in COVID vaccination plans. Countries who received very little quantities of vaccines have shared those with refugees. Rwanda, Kenya, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran. If we look at their own per capita vaccination and still sharing with the refugees, that's where we see the whole potential of inclusion that can be responded to and supported. In conclusion, I think what we are looking at is more data, more evidence, and recognition that displaced population have a potential. They can contribute to their societies and communities they're being hosted at. But this burden and responsibility sharing has to be meaningful. It has to be in equity, and we need to look at it with the way that the whole global compact on refugees is designed to make sure that these countries can host them with a bit of equity and support around that. Now, we are looking at the 1951 Convention, and as the High Commissioner said recently, and I'll just quote, "Those of us fortunate enough to live in relative prosperity and stability cannot take these gifts for granted. The shock of COVID-19 pandemic makes it clear. And those who think the Refugee Convention is either irrelevant or a nuisance may one day find themselves grateful for the protection it affords them. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown, as almost no other crisis can, the vital importance of inclusion, collective, concrete efforts to protect the most vulnerable and to grant these rights to the fullest." I pass it back to you.
And thank you very much also for putting back into focus the IDPs and of course also highlighting the challenges that are posed by the current pandemic, also in your field. That will bring me to the two respondents. The first respondent will be Xavier de Victor from the World Bank. He works as an advisor manager on fragility, conflict, and violence. He has a history at the UNHCR as well, but that was a long time ago. He has already, since the 1990s, been with the World Bank as a country manager of different countries and program coordinator. And I think the World Bank is very well suited. It was already referred to be represented here, also because it works very closely together with, which was also mentioned already, the Prospect Partnerships. So I'd be very happy to hear your contribution. Yes, there you are. You have the floor, Mr. de Victor.
Thank you so much, and thank you very, very much to the Ministry for this invitation, and also for just hosting the panel on or the event on such an important topic. Let me maybe start with a reflection. What we're talking about here is people. It's people living in distressful situations, and it's about finding the best ways to support them. I think it's very important as we proceed through our conversation that we make a genuine effort not to abstractize these issues too much, but remain very, very grounded in the reality of the people, including those who are on the picture in the poster behind my colleague and friend Sajjad Malik. I think so. Maybe a few points that I wanted to propose in as a reflection to what Sajjad was saying. First, to underline that indeed the World Bank has been engaged, increasingly engaged in forced displacement issues, and we've tried to do this in very close partnership with UNHCR to start with. A partnership very much rooted in the principles of the Global Compact on refugee. A partnership that's very much strategic, not transactional. It's not about channeling money. It's really about trying to learn from UNHCR and trying to align our respective instruments and our respective programs. And also trying to think some of these issues through together. Sajjad was referring to the paper that we wrote. Actually, it was written with extensive support by UNHCR. And so this partnership is both at corporate level, but also in the field. And the idea is really for both of our organizations to work in synergy while focusing on what we economists would call our areas of comparative advantage. Now, I underline this partnership. Obviously, the bank is working in other partnerships, and let me mention also prospects and the role of the Dutch government in trying to build this very innovative partnership that includes UNHCR, UNICEF, ILO, and the two branches of the World Bank, IFC, and of the World Bank Group, IFC and the World Bank, to try and support programs towards economic inclusion and education. Now, if you allow me, I'd just like to take just a few very brief moments to think about what does it mean to bring a development approach to this issue? Because at the end of the day, it's not about more money. It's not about different sectors of engagement. It's sometimes not even about the timing of engagement, right? I think a long time ago, there was this notion there was first humanitarians and development at a middle ground where we needed to so-called handover. I think we're past this point. I think we now recognize that these are actually two, humanitarian and development, actually two instruments by the same international community. And that these two instruments have to be wielded in synergy throughout the crisis. So the development approach is not a substitute for humanitarian assistance. And let me say very, very explicitly that humanitarian actors still need financing, even if we are engaged, still need the same sort of amount of financing as they used to have, even if we are engaged, because what we're doing is essentially complement what they're doing. And I think the difference in a way between the development and humanitarian instruments of the international community is about the way we work. We tend to focus very much on medium-term and socioeconomic issues. We tend also, because that's what we've learned, to think that real changes come when policies are improved, government policies are improved, and institutions are strengthened. And therefore, we tend to work primarily with government, to put government in the lead, as we say in our jargon, and to try to reinforce country systems, and also to use data and evidence to that effect. Now, none of this is incompatible with the humanitarian agenda, of course, but it is something that is, once again, complementary. And what I would like really to emphasize for this conversation is really this notion of one international community, different instruments. And the question is, how do you use your hammer and your screwdriver in different yet complementary way throughout the crisis? So we have indeed developed financial instruments to engage. I think this has been the major shift for us. We currently have projects in 18 countries, I think 63 projects for a total of about $3 billion. So that's quite a lot of work. Once again, very, very much in partnership and in synergy with UNHCR. But I also wanted to maybe flag 2 points that Sajjad has mentioned. One is the importance of aligning our policy dialogue. I was really emphasizing the point about the importance of policies in refugee hosting countries. What we call policy dialogue, some of our colleagues call it advocacy dialogue or advocacy effort. Regardless of the vocabulary we use, I think what's really important is that when we engage with the refugee hosting countries, we do so in a manner that is as consistent as possible, and of course, as supportive as possible. And this is why this refugee policy review framework, which goes by an unpronounceable acronym RPRF, is becoming extremely useful by essentially benefiting from UNHCR's insights on the relative strengths and weaknesses of government policies in each of 20 areas, government refugee policies in each of 20 areas. That allows us to, number one, structure and focus choose the areas of focus for our policy dialogue in a kind of systematic manner. And number two, to do this in a coherent way across organizations. So we're very, very grateful to UNHCR for all their engagement on this RPIF, because we do believe that this is an instrument we need to better align our policy dialogues on the ground. And then the last point I wanted maybe to emphasize upon this Sajjad made. Many of us, I guess, around the table are parents. And which of us would be satisfied with our kids having a 68% chance to go to primary school? I mean, what do they know by the time they reach 5th grade, right? And only 34% going to secondary school, right? And so I feel that in a context where about half of refugees are actually children, it is our common interest for both humanitarian and geopolitical reasons to really strengthen our response in this area. And maybe I should stop here.
Thank you very much. I think we're perfectly on time. I will, without much further ado, then continue to our third speaker, to the second respondent, and that is Kelsey Norman, who is a fellow for the Middle East and director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights and Refugees Program. I'm having a note here at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. And one of the reasons, of course, that she is speaking today is because of her recent book on reluctant reception, refugees, migration and governance in the Middle East and North Africa. And I'm sure that you will share some very interesting insights from that book with us here. The floor is yours, and welcome to The Hague.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I actually have a PowerPoint. I don't know if it's possible to...
It is possible, however, there you will need to say next slide, and then the control room will help you, will put the next slide. Am I correct?
Okay.
Yes.
That's correct. Okay, perfect. I can't see it though, so I don't know which slide we're on, but...
You're on the first slide that says presentation.
Wonderful, thank you. So yes, thank you for giving me the honor of presenting here today. I apologize, I can see it now, wonderful. I wasn't able to attend many of the panels earlier, just given the time difference, so I'm so sorry to have missed out on those interesting conversations, and apologies for anything that's sort of repeated by me today. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the question that I primarily address in this book is, how do global South countries respond to migrant and refugee populations? And this is a broad question. Of course, we're talking about many different countries and many different regions. And I specifically focus on the Middle East, North Africa region. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So specifically, I look at 3 countries, Morocco, Egypt, and Turkey. And you can see from this infographic that they're seen as sort of transit countries for both refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants hoping to head up towards Europe. But this infographic is a bit of a misrepresentation that, of course, it's actually not easy to complete those migratory journeys. So many individuals end up staying in countries like Morocco, Egypt, and Turkey for long periods of time and sort of sometimes protracted situations. And, you know, I am using the terms migrants and refugees here. I did speak with both refugees and asylum seekers, but also migrants who are more or less in refugee-like situations. So I'm happy to talk more about those terms in the Q&A. But part of the reason that that these countries are being more or less transformed into host countries has to do with some of the EU's changing border policies over the last several decades, making those migratory journeys much harder to complete, and thus necessitating the question of, well, how do countries in this region, but also in the global south more broadly, respond to migrants or refugees? What kind of policy options do they have? Next slide, please. So part of the impetus for today's conference is, of course, the anniversary of the 1951 Convention. And interestingly, all three of these countries that I'm examining are signatories to the 51 Convention and the 67 Protocol. Turkey, of course, with geographical limitations, as I suspect has already been discussed here today. So these are just some of the agreements that these three countries have in place with the EU, but in terms of a bilateral sense, but that of course doesn't preclude other important agreements that are important when we think about how these countries conceive of the presence of migrants and refugees. Next slide, please. So what I'm proposing in this book, and this is where we get a little more abstract, but I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A, is that sometimes we don't think about the ways that states respond to migrants and refugees as being actual responses when there aren't strong policies or laws in place domestically. So we tend to think about engagement in terms of a response that a state has to migrants and refugees as being either liberal or repressive. So by liberal, we mean a state that's actively working to bring migrants and refugees into a national system by providing social services, by offering education within national schools, offering access to public health or hospitals, things like this. And I think generally speaking, this is what international organizations and countries in the global north would like to see from countries of the global south, right? But that's not always the kind of policy that's in place, and generally not often the policy that's in place. We also can conceive of a more repressive response that actually aims to, round up migrants or refugees or asylum seekers, to detain them, to actually, in some cases, even deport them from a host state. But I think what we more often see, and what I'm arguing in this book, is this, what I call strategic indifference. So this is the idea that states aren't going to take a very hands-on, proactive approach to migrants and refugees. Rather, they're going to sort of proclaim indifference to the issue. And what this means is that it invites international organizations like the UNHCR, like IOM, as well as local domestic civil society organizations to step in and provide all those services for the state, or sort of on the state's behalf to migrants and refugees. And this is, it works out pretty well for a lot of states for periods of time, until maybe something like, an issue of migrants and refugees becomes politicized or securitized, and then maybe a state will act differently. But strategic indifference, I argue, basically offers more or less development funding for the state in terms of international organizations providing funding that not only benefits refugees, but often also benefits host country nationals. And it works in states where refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants can more or less de facto integrate into host state systems. And this is basically, this works in urban contexts, which, as we know, most refugees in the world do live in urban environments, and certainly all migrants do in the global south. So if you can go to the next slide then. Actually, in the interest of time, I'll kind of skip over this, basically just talking about some of the evidence that I bring to bear on this question, involving a lot of interviews in the three countries that I look at over a period of time, and speaking both with government officials, UN actors, NGOs, and individual migrants and refugees of a variety of nationalities. Okay, if we could go to the next slide then. So what I talk about at great length in this book is the ways in which this policy of strategic indifference structures the lives of migrants and refugees who end up living under these types of policies. And what I argue is that, again, this works in urban environments where migrants and refugees can more or less live amongst host country nationals. These are just some snapshots from certain neighborhoods that are basically known as refugee, asylum seeker, and migrant sort of neighborhoods in different cities in the countries that I was looking at. So they're living amongst host country nationals. They're also often finding access to informal employment, generally not formal employment, as I'm sure has been discussed today. Most countries, or at least certainly the three countries that I've looked at, even if in some cases certain nationals were eligible to find employment in the formal economy, most were not able to. Practically speaking, it's quite difficult for a number of reasons. And then the next slide, please. So what I want to demonstrate in this book is that even though from a legal and sort of policy perspective, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants have difficulty participating in formal ways, they're participating to a great extent informally, whether that's economically, socially, or even politically in some cases. So they're finding jobs, as I said, in the informal economy. The picture on the left is two individuals working at a restaurant in Gaziantep, for example, two individuals from Syria. They're finding co-nationals or sometimes individuals from other nationalities whom they can find housing with, as in the picture from Rabat in the middle. And they're also learning about the informal norms that are really important in their host states. For example, in the picture on the left, finding out which police officers are friendly and which other types of security officers that they need to avoid. So even when the formal participation, whether economically, socially, politically, is not necessarily possible, they're still able to participate informally to a great extent. Sorry, I guess I'm seeing that I have very little time left. I just wanted to go on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, someone messaged me saying 1 minute. Okay, good. I'll continue on for just another few minutes then, if that's okay. So I want to jump forward in a slightly different direction now and talk about a new project that I'm working on, because I think it brings to bear on the question of, well, how can we incentivize maybe more formal participation, or how can we ensure that individuals have access to rights in countries that we're calling countries of transit, but that are also host states in their own right. And so I think this question changed a little bit after the 2015, quote unquote crisis of asylum seekers arriving in Europe and Europe's subsequent various responses, including the European Trust Fund for Africa, which I caught a little bit of the previous session, and I know that was being discussed. So if we recall, the EUTF was sort of a big pot of money that was put together by Europe after in November 2015, sort of shortly after the Paris attacks and the rhetoric around refugees and Europe's willingness to receive asylum seekers and allow them to stay began to change. So this money was put together. Various countries across North and Sub-Saharan Africa have had access to it. And basically a colleague and I, Nick Masinski of the University of Maine, are looking at how has this money actually been used on the ground, and how is it changing the situation for refugees and asylum seekers, but also for host country nationals and citizens and governance, broadly speaking, in the countries that are receiving it. So specifically, we're looking at Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya. If I could go to the next slide, please. So when we look at those 4 countries, which altogether there were 169 projects that were across those 4 different countries funded by the EUTF between 2015 and 2020, and we look at the way that Europe has allocated this money in the sort of categories to which it allocates those funds, it's a little bit unclear how that money is being spent. So for example, the largest category is improved migration management, but one could argue that all of this money is being used towards migration management effectively. So it's not clear what that means exactly, and it doesn't give us a lot of insight into how that money is being spent domestically. So what we've gone through is we've taken these 169 projects along with the more than 1,000 documents that are that pertain to them, and recoded them with a team of researchers here at Rice University. Next slide, please. And once we recode them according to our code book, which we'll make available and we're happy to share, we can see, I think we get a better picture of how that money is actually being spent domestically. So for example, economic development is the largest category in terms of how funds are being allocated, which is in line with what the EUTF proclaims to want to do, right? It wants to improve economic development and allegedly democratic governance in countries of origin and transit, with the ultimate aim of preventing onward migration towards Europe. But we can see, for example, the second most prominent category, oops, if you could just go back, yeah, thank you, is state capacity. And that's where we're wondering if there's the possibility for sort of unintended side effects, perhaps, if a lot of that funding is going towards institutions in a recipient country, for example, ministries of the interior or security forces, with the goal of securing borders, but what are the spillover effects of that type of funding and support for states? And that's part of what we're hoping to investigate with this project, as well as you can see a number of other categories that are being funded through this pot of money. Next category. And I think, sorry, next slide I meant. So I think that this is particularly important given some of the rhetoric around the EUTF and how exactly that funding is being spent domestically. For example, the director of the German Development Agency here says, one thing is clear, human rights come first. We do not strengthen autocratic structures. No money goes to the governments of the countries we work in. But if you can see from the next slide, we know at least from these 4 countries that we're looking at that that's not true. So about 20% of funding is going directly to governments, and we're looking at which ministries or actors within a state are receiving that funding, but that there's also just a number of different funding structures that are in place with the EUTF, whether it's NGOs are being funded directly or if an EU delegation is being funded. So what we're doing with this project, and we're still in the midst of it all, is trying to understand how that money is being spent domestically. Last slide. So to just sort of tie this all together, I've argued in this book that I recently published this year that global south states often are going to turn to this strategic indifference, what I'm calling strategic indifference, to manage refugee and migrant populations. And certainly I think global north states, as well as international organizations and some domestic actors too, civil rights groups, maybe refugees themselves, would like to see states implement a more liberal policy, right, and take on more responsibility for refugee, asylum seeker, and maybe even migrant populations. We have seen states, for example, in my study, Turkey and Morocco, that do turn towards more liberal policies. But the problem is that because of the incentives that led them to do so, sometimes these policies are mostly for show, and they're not so much about ensuring actual rights for refugees on the ground. So I'm a little bit weary of just offering sort of more financial incentives or even diplomatic incentives to global south countries in turn for implementing a more liberal policy, because it doesn't always mean that they're going to follow through on implementation on the ground. But nonetheless, I think a major takeaway from my book is that it's really critical to understand the incentives of various global south states. I mean, states generally speaking, but particularly I'm looking at global south states here, to understand what are their incentives regarding refugee and migration policies, because I think there's a lot of assumptions about how they'll act, and some of those don't always pan out. And then lastly, last sentence, I promise. So lastly, in terms of my new project, and I think this ties in, if we're going to offer aid, if the global north or international organizations are going to offer aid towards supporting refugees in the global south, we have to make sure it's non-fungible, it can't be utilized for other purposes or reallocated, that it's rights-oriented and not just security-oriented, and that there should be an emphasis on transparency and accountability, which really are lessons from sort of the broader understanding of how foreign aid needs to operate. So thank you for that. I appreciate the opportunity to present today.
Thank you very much. And also thank you very much for providing some much needed transparency. I'm sure that there's someone from the European Parliament who would be very interested in learning more about your research. The Court of Auditors is also referred to the Trust Fund and its intransparency. I'd be very interested now in hearing perhaps Mr. Malik, if you would like to respond to anything of the two that the two discussants have said, maybe also reply to the strategic indifference if you or Mr. De Victor would like to come in on that. So Mr. Malik, you would have the floor if you wish. I think you're still muted.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, all right. Now, thank you very much for both. I think it's important to recognize that the engagement with governments on policy reforms, yes, investments are going in these countries, but the policy trade-off discussion is important to have. It is in some countries, and we've seen through some of the investments that are going in, if we have, carefully track where the changes are coming in. Sometimes the changes are slow to come for various reasons, and we know they've been hosting refugees. I can remember Afghan refugees crossing the border, and I come from very close to the Afghan border in Pakistan when I was in high school. they're still in Pakistan for the last 40 years. And in millions in that. And I was in Kenya receiving Somali refugees when the Dadaab refugee camps were being opened. And we were told to establish the camp for three years. It's now 33 years that those camps are on the ground. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that this burden that has been on these host countries for protracted period and left for decades on humanitarian assistance only, what is called care and maintenance, very basic education, very basic assistance. Generations have gone through those camps, blocked their potential, no education, no livelihoods, no jobs, no interactions. And we have seen that in the same countries, if there's some incentives that are provided and there's support that goes into that country, and there's careful management of debate and discussion with the policy reform, changes do come in. Kilobiai, Kenya is one example. It's still not there where we want it to be, but at least change is coming in. Rwanda, on the other hand, had relatively liberal policies in the region. And their support that went in, even if they had liberal policies, if the support was not there, they would not have been able to manage the work that they have done. I think that encouragement needs to go in these countries where the incentives are. Lebanon, it's in a very difficult state right now because of its own situation. But Lebanon, when Syrian refugees cross the border, they open up their schools, double shifts, making sure that children can go to school. Syrians hold education very dear to them. And when they crossed the border and could not find education, it was really a big blow to the parents, to population in general, parents in particular, that they come from a country where education levels are very high, 96% primary education, and all of a sudden they become refugees and no support there. The World Bank, GCFF financing and others had helped their creating that capacity. Similarly in Jordan, in Venezuela situation, Colombia, you see many examples where there are policies of that could be provided and supported with that. Then the right to education, you can see a little bit more in practice. You can see public health support is being provided. What we want to see is more of those practices and not parallel services created for decades. Because then in those parallel services now, we also need to keep in mind what's happening around the globe. We keep on asking refugee hosting countries to be more liberal, open, inclusive, and all the rest, but we also see borders being closed elsewhere. We're also seeing refoulement, pushback, externalization, all these things. So debate is becoming extremely difficult, and it's not necessarily tied to always to resources, but resources are needed. There's hardly enough for the development of their own population. And that also in periphery area, not in the capitals, not in the centers. These are always remote areas where refugees are being hosted, and their assistance is absolutely required in that. So I think it's the support that we see, that when we say World Bank has been a game changer, it's a fact they brought a new dimension to this whole debate. And in reality, in practice, it's not just a debate around that. And I think others are beginning to see that this debate has to happen. So let me just add one more perspective here, which is important. So in a refugee hosting countries, government, receives support from many partners. World Bank talks to the same government. Other bilateral development partners talk to the same government. And then government has perspectives from various partners, not necessarily always aligned. And that also creates a lot of difficulties for government to harmonize this debate that is happening around those areas. I think upstream, there's also more discussion needs to happen. This debate is good to have, to understand the perspectives around, from practitioners, from researchers, from donor governments, from ministries, foreign affairs. All these are important discussions to have. Rights focus on that, but also in true spirits of burden and responsibility sharing is absolutely essential to go with it. Otherwise, we cannot keep on telling them to do certain things, refugee hosting countries, but not match with what we are doing in our own backyard, but also how the support gets to them. It's all important in that sense.
Thank you very much. Before I open up the floor to questions, possibly from the chat, but also from here, I was wondering, Mr. De Victor, would you perhaps still like to come in on this? I was very much triggered by the complementarity on the humanitarian and development dimension. Maybe you could elaborate on that a bit in the light of what Kelsey has just been telling us. If you're still with us. No? Sorry, he's gone? He's gone, okay. Well, then, so far so good. I see no, I see no questions. That's the challenges of hybrid. There he is, yes. Mr. De Victor, you're back. You are still muted, I'm afraid. You're still muted? Yes. Let's see. I think you can unmute yourself.
Maybe try it without the headphones. I think it's not saying he's muted, actually.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, exactly. No, you are not muted. Oh, we were doing so well. No, now I don't see anyone. I'm just going to. Are there any questions from the floor, and then we can throw these in and see who of our three speakers is willing. I see Tineke already. Tineke Strik. Willem, if you could be so kind to give her the floor, and then I hope, and I hope the control room will have everyone lined up. I see another question there.
Yeah. So you houdt hem vast, hè? Yeah, to Mr. Malik, I concur very much with you, the importance of access to education. And I wonder, because in many refugee hosting countries, the education system is also limited for own inhabitants. Are there concrete projects already within that other, more wealthy states also support educational systems through their own universities or education systems? I can imagine we learned a lot from COVID-19, how much you can do with remote support in that sense. And to Mrs. Norman, if I may, I find it very interesting, your scenario of strategic indifference, and also showing that there's a kind of show to comply with the conditions. I wonder, shouldn't that may have to do also with knowing that what the priority of the EU is, namely the objective of combating irregular migration instead of improving the situation of refugees? And could a change be made? Like, I really think EU member states think we can only use our leverage once. And the most important thing for us is border closed and readmission. But suppose if we turn it around, if we prioritize the condition of having good circumstances and perspectives for refugees in hosting countries, without having this additional condition of border controls, and what do you think what would happen? Would that indeed lead to people building up their futures over there? Or would there still be a ground for fear from states that people will still stay on the move towards the West?
Before you answer, I see there's one or two more questions from the side of Foreign Affairs. Yes, please. And then, Mr. De Victor, I will come back to you to see if we manage to hear you here now. But first, the gentleman from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah, good afternoon. Interesting presentations. And also the reaction of Tineke Strik is relevant here. I think we're talking about two different things. One is the development approaches to displacement in the regions of origin. And the other one is plain migration management. I wouldn't go as far as Madame Strik to say that the interest of the EU is just to curb irregular migration. That's part of the interest, indeed. We're a bit schizophrenic in that respect. I think also another part of the EU is sincerely trying to help improve lives of refugees. But I see the same in the presentation of Madame Norman, because you're saying like the support should really go to right-based, right-based interventions and so on, as if you're hinting at sort of the cooperation with dodgy governments in terms of curbing irregular migration. While at the same time, I think an important takeaway from this forum should be that unless we take other countries' governments that are receiving refugees seriously in equal partnerships, we're not going to resolve this problem.
Thank you very much. 3 very clear questions. Can I ask you to answer them perhaps briefly? And I will start with Kelsey Norman and then go down the line. So you have the floor first.
Yeah, thank you to both questions. I see sort of a similarity, so I'll try to just answer them together. I think both of you sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of part of, I think, my argument is exactly as the last commenter said, to take countries in the global south more seriously as equal partners. And yet, of course, some of these partners do have questionable human rights records, treatment towards their own citizens. So how can we do both, right? How can we take them seriously, but also ensure that that money that's being offered or that support that's being offered is actually benefiting those whom it would hope to benefit. And I think there's one is, as I said at the end of my presentation, ensuring that aid is fungible and non-fungible, in terms of it being spent on exactly what it needs to be spent on and not being allocated for potentially other purposes, potentially repressive purposes. But also, I think there's a hypocrisy element to it, right? And I think this was alluded to in the very end of the last presentation, which I was able to catch, in terms of, if the underlying goal of the EUTF is to prevent onward migration towards Europe, I think other countries are not, they're going to see that. They understand that, and they understand how that can be potentially manipulated or utilized to benefit their own governments. And so I think that that countries in Europe, as well as my own country, the United States, and other countries of the global north, have to step up in terms of not just offering money, which has become the name of the game in terms of this alleged burden sharing that was discussed in the previous panel. I think that countries of the global north have to take on actual responsibility for refugees and asylum seekers in terms of resettlement, in terms of alternative pathways to physically getting people from countries in the global south. And I don't think that just offering aid is a substitute for actually participating in the global refugee system. So I think that that's sort of the dual-pronged answer to how to better engage with global refugee burden sharing, but also how to engage with countries of the global south, even those who maybe have questionable human rights records.
Thank you very much. Then I'll go on to Sajjad Malik. Would you perhaps answer to some of the questions or part of the questions?
Yeah, thanks. And I think let me just on the education, the question which was quite important for us to look at. Yes, we are working on it. It's very important aspect of when you're looking at the potential that refugees have displaced, and including IDPs. It's the same problem with any forced displacement, that if they remain in a situation in limbo for a protracted period of time and there's no education, obviously you'll have to do things about it. Now, during COVID time, we did come around lockdowns, universities and schools getting shut down. Then connectivity became a major problem in refugee hosting countries. We did not have, like most of the countries in middle income countries where there is connectivity, there are tools available. Most of refugee camps do not have electricity, do not have connectivity, let alone the tools that are required for such education to be brought. So different means were applied there just to continue bringing education to these people. So yes, we have learned from COVID, but the challenges were also exposed that if we do not have these basics that are taken for granted in our part of the world, is not there for refugees, then of course there's something that needs to be done. So we're working on that. For secondary, there's a challenge that we need to make sure, working with governments, but we need support. It's not us needing support, it's those refugees and forcibly displaced that need support to be included in the national education system. Cannot create parallel structures for secondary and primary and tertiary, so need to be included in that. On the tertiary side, as I mentioned, Germany has been supporting on tertiary scholarship for the last 30 years, the DAFI program. We're looking for other donors, universities to come in and join us on that. We're going for a campaign which is now called 15 by 30, which means we want to increase the secondary education level from 5% currently to 15% by 2030. Still far below international standards, but we are saying, let's bring a few more to universities. And we saw the value of it during COVID. Refugees, DAFI scholarship students who have gone to universities, public health, nurses, doctors, contributed to the societies in many countries. They've been in the forefront in fighting COVID, and they've shown to these countries how important it is that if you have educated refugees living amongst you, they can contribute to that. So I think that one focus will remain quite a lot. The other thing I would like to highlight is it's not replacing humanitarian assistance with development. That's not the question. We'll still need humanitarian support, but it's cannot stop at just the life-saving humanitarian activities. You need to invest in activities such as education, public health, social protection, livelihoods, all these which we have discussed in the previous panels. These investments are required and for extended period around that. One last example, Afghanistan, we're discussing quite extensively now. The debate there is quite political. There's life-saving work that needs to be done and it's going on, but that's not enough. We can bring life-saving assistance, but we also need to bring assistance for them to live. We are having a debate right now in Afghanistan, humanitarian plus or development minus. While the needs in that country, for the people of Afghanistan, that's something that is a big debate that's happening right now. If that doesn't happen, of course it will implode. Of course, there's no other alternative but people for them to move. Then the borders are closed and you move, and then you can look at the whole equation around that. So it's the root causes that need to be addressed as well, that it's not just looking at the displacement, but also looking at some of these areas from where displacement is happening. And there, Afghanistan is a very clear example right now that is being looked at. And lastly, on
Mr. I'm going to have to ask you to maybe one final conclusion.
One final conclusion is that, look, if for the livelihoods, it had devastating impact on populations when they were informal economy, in jobs that they were earning that was totally an informal sector, not really recognized on that. When lockdowns happened, they were the first ones to be impacted. And then the downward spiral has given them the legal vulnerabilities, absolutely critical that we need to look into as we go along into some of these programs. I stop here, otherwise the risk is that I continue moving on these issues, so I pass it back to you.
Thank you very much. I'm getting messages from all sides that I have to wrap up, but I do want to give the possibility for maybe one last final comment from Mr. De Victor, because so sadly you were muted either on our side or on your side. I don't know, but maybe we can see if you still can give us one or two words to wave us off with. No, I'm afraid you're still muted. I'm very sorry. This is unfortunately. I do want to thank you. We're very happy that at least your first comment was clear to all. I would like to thank all three speakers and conclude this panel. A round of applause. And before we conclude this day, there are still two speakers that I would like to invite to the floor. And that is, first of all, Mrs. Mariette Schuurman, Director of Stabilization and Humanitarian Assistance, which is the division of Foreign Affairs that so kindly and importantly initiated and supported this conference. You have the floor. You may stand at the... Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, never mind.
Okay, it works.
It's all remotely controlled.
Good, excellent, that's better. So thank you very much for allowing us to give us the floor. It's for some concluding remarks after a very rich conversation that we had. Obviously, we would like to thank first of all the Commissie Meijers, the speakers, the audience, for showing up at this important conversation, even if virtually, despite all the challenges. And it shows how important and meaningful this conversation is. Cooperation on refugee responses is again one of the critical issues of our time. And it is worth recalling, as it was done today, that the Refugee Convention was initially adopted to guarantee the rights and the dignity to help millions of displaced people in post-war Europe. And Europe is now a place people may want to flee to, but it's worth to keep in mind that things once were different, and it may change. There's no guarantee that in Europe we're immune from this type of human tragedy. So the Refugee Convention is here to protect not just people far away in some abstract, less fortunate regions, but like every piece of international law, it's here to protect all of us, should we need it. And I think that was clearly expressed today. That said, today's conversation was particularly valuable for highlighting another critical actor, countries and communities that host refugees. It's there that the rights transform from a legal concept into a lived reality through co-creation of a shared, dignified life for all. So today we've heard of them and about them, and if sadly, maybe not always from them. But their place and their importance in this global conversation is unquestionable. 70 years on, the Refugee Convention gives us the tools and the fundaments to protect refugees, but it's both the refugees and their hosts whom we must strive to support in realization of their coexisting rights to safe and dignified lives. So the Netherlands is firmly committed to supporting both refugees and host communities in these efforts. And I highlighted a few reminders that today's conversation gave me. I think Marjoleine Ziek at the opening very clearly stated that the states who can least afford it carry the biggest burden. So we need equitable responsibility and burden sharing, and that's what also the Global Compact on Refugees is about. And upholding the spirit of the convention, as Tineke Strik said, is a shared responsibility, but also a shared interest, as I just said. The Global Compact on Refugees, like the convention, I think Gerald Knaus clearly said there was it's a good document, but no political interest to uphold it. And I think the concept of strategic indifference is not something only that applies to hosting countries, but maybe is sadly a common denominator for many governments. That said, I think there's also a reason, as Sajjad said, to look at meaningful responsibility and burden sharing and the importance to invest in the potential of refugees, the importance to invest in work, in education, and meaningful and sustainable protection. And that's actually what we try to do through our Prospects partnership. And there's other partnerships that are being developed. And partnerships and policy dialogue is really what we need in order to live better on this shared responsibility and burden sharing. So I think this platform and this conversation today has been very valuable in terms of hearing and exchanging opinions and learnings on these important topics. We will take them with us for our daily work in terms of advocacy and policy dialogues and programming. And we will remain grateful for all the valuable contributions today to make sure indeed we live up to the commitments we entered into in 1951, but also more recently through the Global Compact on Refugees, and to give meaningful, to design collectively meaningful ways for burden sharing and responsibility sharing in the interest of us all. So thank you for this very valuable conversation today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those words and for this this fruitful cooperation, I would say. But I'm going to hand over the floor for some final words. Ashley Terlouw, the president of the Meijers Committee.
I make it quick. Thank you very, very much for this rich insights in our theme of today, reception in the region. I saw pessimism. Ms. Norman talked about strategic indifference. Mr. Malik talked about protected situations. Mr. Knaus said the borders are closed and pushbacks will be legalized. But I also saw some optimism. Mr. Betts showed us how displaced persons can build economies. And Mr. Malik said refugees can be contributors. And he showed us the potential of refugees. I heard important ideas. First of all, money matters. Mrs. Norman and Mr. De Victor showed that how much we can do with money, but it should be rights-oriented and not security-oriented. Mrs. Strict had the idea of a global refugee fund, but said don't make it conditional. And several speakers, like Mr. Wouters and Mr. Malik said, it is so important to team up with partners, with other organizations, and Mrs. Strick said, invest in equal partnerships. I learned a lot. I learned about the lack of equitable responsibility sharing of Mrs. Ziek, and of that common responsibility is the only way forward, Mrs. Streek. And I learned about the additional protection of other human rights instruments and ILO instruments from Slingenberg and Wouters. I learned how central the rights to work and the right of mobility are. And I learned how the World Bank can be a game changer. And remember, and I will always remember, that half of the refugees are children. The Refugee Convention is still relevant, but we need a political will. That is the main challenge. And we, as the rich Western countries, should give the good example. Thank all contributors, speakers, panel chairs, the audience. Thanks also very much again to the museum for the excellent technical support. Thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the idea and for hosting, especially Mrs. Schuurman for the final and very interesting words. And a special thanks to Willem Hutte, the Secretary of the Meijers Committee, and so much more than that. We have a lot to celebrate. We have to celebrate the anniversary of the Refugee Convention. We also have to celebrate that Jana Wessels just heard that she won a great fund of the German NVO. Congratulations, Jana Wessels. And I also want to mention again that I'm really happy that Lineke Slingenberg got a professorship. Congratulations, Lineke. And with all these things to celebrate, I would say it's time for drinks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.